Well, it might be kind of cool if we could get like Nate Hoffman on here too, right? So we could do like Alex, Nate, you, me. It'd be like Clusterfuckapalooza times 9/11.
Last time we had Nate on in any capacity, it was terrible.
Nate is just terrible.
Yeah.
Oh damn! I know what we should do. We need to try and get Nigel on here, so that way Nigel can tell you how stupid you are for hating his Marauder list.
Yeah. Hello, welcome to Learn to Wargame, the audio podcast. This is Brandon, or PG Mutilus on the forums, and I still have like 10 days to say that.
I think it's like 8. This is Jeremy. Go by Lord Fool.
This is Scott. I go by Scotty on the forums, and I play Troll Bloods.
Or Seabass.
I'm Seabass. I'm sorry. We need to redo this. This is Seabass. I play Troll Bloods.
Oh, thank God. I had no idea who that was.
This is Ritchie. I play Legion and Kador. I go by Rich423 on the forums.
And this is Alex. I go by Tinkling Koala. I'm not usually on the forums, but I am now that the CID thing is getting up.
Alright, so today we're going to have a few topics, but primarily we're going to be talking about the 2017 SteamRoller packet that hit Community Integrated Development today, or CID if you prefer. And, not today, sorry, it happened this week. It's been up for about 5 days now, I think. And so there's been a lot of talk with the devs and stuff about a particular point that we'll talk on a lot, which is pre-measuring and restricting it in a few ways. So basically, if you live under a rock, hey, we're playtesting SteamRoller 2017. Basically, the big changes are you no longer score to 5 points, you have to now win by 6 points. Assassination is still a victory condition. There's now a turn cap. The game ends at turn 7, and if no other victory conditions are met, the player with the most control points wins the game. And the new scenarios are able to score a lot more points per round. There's generally 3 to 4 zones is not uncommon in the new packet. I think the fewest number of points you can score in a turn is 3, and that's on recon, and you can only score 3 once. You score 2 the other turns. And most, you can score 4 to 6, but 6 is like the high extreme, with recon being the low extreme.
And Killbox.
Killbox is on every scenario, and it's now 10 inches, not 14. Still give up 2 control points when you do it. I think lastly, the certain types of scenario elements are only scoreable by certain types of models. So first off, only warrior models can score round zones. They no longer have to be of a certain count of their starting value. It's simply all models must be touching the zone, and it must not be contested. Rectangles are only scoreable by Warjacks, Warbeasts, and Battle Engines while they're not contested. Flags are only scoreable by Warcasters, and Warcasters can score anything. So that kind of breaks the other rules. So Warcasters score all 3. Obviously, destroying an enemy objective still gives you 1. The objectives change slightly. Read through them. They're all a little different, but we're not going to go into each one because they're probably going to change before they get to play anyway. And then, importantly, is there's basically an amendment to the basic rules of the game in SteamRoller. One of a lot of people's problems with it so far is it's a SteamRoller amendment, not an errata to the main rulebook. What it says is you're restricted to a proxy base being on the table that isn't representing where a model is. They limit you to 1. And then what we have so far, other than that, is cannot leave measuring tools in play once a measurement has been completed. For example, you cannot put down a 10-inch range stick outside of Harbinger's base to mark her control range and leave it there for the whole turn. Also, there are things you can't leave other table markers, I believe they call them, which is basically anything used to mark a point on the table. So you can't put a bunch of tokens down to show a control area and stuff like that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of really common practices this touches on. One is pre-measuring where a model can move to, or like alternate locations for if this model goes here and this model goes here, what's the distance between them? Because you can't have more than one table marker down at a time. Like you can only have one proxy base down at a time. You can't even mark like, well, this is where the edge of this model's base is, because that would be another table marker. You can only have one table marker down. And there's a bunch of situations that makes significantly more complicated to measure.
For example, like generally the way I measure difficult terrain is the easiest way it has always been. let's say my model advances, and at some point during his charge movement, he contacts terrain. I put a proxy base down at the line in which he contacts it, and then I basically put down a range stick next to those two bases to make a perfect line, and then I put a proxy base down once he leaves the rough terrain. So if he's just barely clipping it, sometimes it's really hard to tell how much of the terrain he's moving through. But by putting a proxy base at where he touches it and where he ends, you can just measure the distance between them from front to front of one base to another. And that will tell you how much of his distance is in rough terrain, and will let you actually calculate how much movement he gets. And it works the same as if you start in the terrain. You just put the proxy base exactly as he's leaving it in the line you're moving and measure that, and that's how much extra movement you have to spend. So it's a perfect system for measuring terrain. And when I get called as a judge, that's how I resolve rough terrain. And everyone sees me do it, and they're like, that's really good. I'm going to start doing that. Well, that's an exact example of things you cannot do now.
There's also another game situation which this current ruling makes absolutely illegal to measure properly, which is impact attacks on cavalry. Because the way you have to do it, you have to declare where you're charging to, put down a table marker for that, and then laser line and see if you contact any models. Where you contact them, you have to put down another base to determine where you're contacting models on a given heading. Under this rule, you're not allowed to legally measure impact attacks.
Well, you're not allowed to accurately measure them. You're allowed to completely inaccurately call them. But yeah. So, you could put it down and throw down the laser and say, well, I think these guys are in the line, but your model actually has to stop there. You can't just not mark where the model is. You have to you have to then basically pick up simultaneously the proxy base that you put down for where you're charging to, and put it where you're impacting to represent your model. Or you have to pick up the model and move it to where he impacts, while not moving the laser line at all, which is literally impossible. So it just adds all these extra problems to it. In addition to, all the other problems for measuring that situation becomes a nightmare.
Unless I'm completely mistaken, I think the dev talk actually addresses this, because they do allow you to use multiple markers for the purposes of, moving a model, and then at the end of that model's movement or activation, they all need to be picked up. Right?
No, that is not how it's working.
It is, they allow you to use measuring tools, but a proxy base is specifically not called out in measuring tools. In fact, it is specifically said that it is not a measuring tool, I believe. Is that right, Alex? Or am I completely wrong here?
That's correct.
Okay. So, and there's different aspects of this that we're going to go into. I made, if anybody follows me on Facebook or just follows certain people on Facebook, you've probably seen my post. But I made a very long post today, and I tried to break it up into as many small comments as possible, because it's really easy to start talking and then hit a tangent and leave and not finish all the points we want to talk about on that thing. So try and keep it scattered. Let's try and only talk about, and we're doing a good job so far, but only talk about the very specific things we're talking about until we're done, and then we'll move on. So what we were talking about is basically the exact interaction. So things you cannot do that are illegal. And this is amended because when it was originally published, it said specifically you could only use one measuring tool at a time. Well, I designed a set of maneuvering tools called steppers that muse on many cells, which are basically just little arcs that are 1 inch long that you can stack end to end to make a movement of a model chain in 1 inch increments, which is perfect for moving around a model. And I've never seen anyone move around a circular object correctly, ever. Because they always either clip the inside or cut themselves huge amounts of lost movement. And every time I pull them out and get them down, everyone's like, oh, this is actually perfect. And so that's something that was, objectively illegal until they errated it to say you could use any number of maneuver tools. So at least they've given us that. I'm going to say that as a plus. They've realized that is required, and they're giving us that.
Yeah, and I watched... on the day that the CID went live, I watched 2 players attempt to use steppers when that was prohibited. It took longer than any other action they had taken that game to resolve that, because they could only have one down at a time. It's almost totally infeasible under that initial wording. Thankfully, it's no longer the case.
So, other things that you cannot do, anything that we used to be able to do that is objectively illegal now, obviously. And what we've heard in theory is things that they're trying to actively avoid with this is that some people apparently may have been completely pre-measuring their entire turns, and not saying I have measured out everything I plan to do, like, on a specific model, but, like, literally putting a proxy base down for every model in their army and moving it forward where they think it's going to go, and, like, measuring ranges to all these proxy bases and moving them all around. Effectively, like, if anybody's familiar with the term Paganiing, but doing that with their entire army simultaneously for, like, 10 minutes at a time, and then saying, okay, all my models move here, basically, and then doing all the activations really quickly. I don't know if that has happened. I mean, it's certainly possible or probable, but I've played a lot of Mark III, and I go to a lot of places. I've never seen anyone come close to doing that.
I've seen that happen precisely once ever.
Okay. How many models did he have when he did it?
It was a Wormwood player, and let's see, battle group plus shifting stones. It was maybe on the order of 20 models. Mm-hmm. It did not take him very long.
And exactly, that's like the army that you might be able to do it with, because the like you said, that army is not very big. But did he actually do it for every single model, or did he just do it for like all the important stuff, like my caster, Cassius, the stones, and like 3 heavies? Or did he like literally do it for all the stones, like all the swamp shamblers, all the sentry mannequins? Did he actually do it for every model, or just like the important ones?
It was just the important ones. And I mean, like, I can think of situations where I've done lengthy proxy pre-measuring to make sure I'm...
Yeah, I said in my post that the most I've ever really seen anybody do I think was like 12 at a time, and it's because he was activating a full unit of trenchers. Or maybe it was 15, because he literally had the full unit. And so he pre-measured where all their clouds were going, so he pre-measured like 12 of the 15. I was like, that's the most I've ever seen anyone do at one time. I see commonly, you'll see on like between 3 and 8 on the high end. But it's just like, most times, like, you just don't need to. Like, there's no benefit in that. Like, I know these guys are walking directly towards your guys with their guns, and I'm going to shoot you. Like, I don't need to pre-measure that. I don't need to proxy that out. It's completely pointless.
Right. The lengthiest fancy assassinations, like, all right, I can definitely get to your caster and freeze them. The question is, can I actually put enough shooters on you to kill you without them blocking each other's, like, final locations or whatever? And that, you know, that kind of takes a while, and often I'll say, no, I can't do it, and then remove all the proxy bases and embark on a new plan. And, I mean, it's something we'll touch on later, but the only person to pay a cost for that is me on my plan.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, things we can do. Is there anything else we want to talk about?
I mean, you mentioned it with stepper markers, but circumnavigation, even if you don't have stepper markers, like the most effective way to do circumnavigation around any obstacle is to place a proxy base, measure to that one, place another one, measure to that one, place another one, measure to that one. That's
like you're moving you're serpentining, like effectively moving in a perfect zigzag. That is hands down the best way to move it, because you can place all these markers, make sure you're not contacting models or overlapping things or moving through rough terrain, and then measure the distance from proxy to proxy at closest point to closest point, and actually get the distance moved, which doing small incremental movement is the only way to do that, and that is the least accurate way you can possibly move. Like, every time you measure a model, you're going to be off. It's not if you're off, it's how much you're off. And when people do these quick movements, you're going to break it up and make the entire thing less accurate. Like, every time you move, you're going to have like plus or minus 10% maybe of an inch. So if you're moving in half-inch increments and you're moving like 10 inches, let's say a model's running and 10 is not far, that means you might get, like, if you're intentionally trying to squeeze it, trying to make it close as possible, and you just happen to be up on most of them, you could get like almost an extra inch of movement out of that. And not even intentionally, but just by accident.
Right. And to take it back to Mark II, like, the movements that I saw where pre-measuring was most essential, or would have been most essential, and were the greatest source of inaccuracies, were not charges. Charges were pretty routinely dead on. The ones that were always messed up were full advances. Full advances were the single largest source of error that I saw playing in Mark II.
I did just think of a situation in which I'm going to be very sad to see stuff go. So, like, when my Ulans go to charge, like, they all have reach, so it's generally easy to get everyone in. But being able to pre-measure to actually make sure that works without cheating somebody is like, oh, I charge you and I have reach, so I can attack through my own guys, but like my guys block my line of sight. So like I want to move one guy in and make sure the next guy can get in without losing line of sight, make sure the next guy can move that line of sight, and do that for all 5 of them. And then also because my models just don't fit anywhere, because they have like 4-inch lances that hang over their base. And so like doing that and just being able to put 5 proxies down is like, my guys are moving here and I measure range for each one of them. And like, okay, so we all know they can get here and they can get here. And then it's not a cluster when I go to move them. And it's not a nightmare anymore. It's just very convenient. And I want to touch more on that later, but I think that's more of a different topic. I think we've pretty much covered the things you can't do anymore that you used to be able to do. Does anyone have anything else they want to add?
I had a pretty extensive post on this in the CID board. There are a couple of situations surrounding place effects. For example, Haley 2 wants to walk and TK a model. You want to measure to where that model will be once it's TK'd. That's not legal. You can't measure the proxy base for her walk and the final location for TK at the same time.
Trying to think of all the weird interactions, like hell-mouthing stuff, like see where a model is after it gets pushed, and seeing if like a model will contact another model and things like that. Sorry, people are now responding to my post on Facebook, so I'm like getting blown up on notifications. So I think that we're going to move past that. We might come up to more stuff you can't do in the future during the cast. So now let's talk about like what everything is considered. Does anybody have the document pulled up in front of them? Yes. Okay, so whoever has the document pulled up, I guess Jeremy, do you want to read through the different types of things? There's like table markers, proxy bases, and maneuver tools, I think.
Let's see here. Tokens and templates, representing in-game effects such as focus, fury, spells, AoEs. Actual proxy base represents a model that cannot fit physically into a space.
Okay, so when it's actually representing a model and where the model is supposed to be because the model can't do that. Right. Okay.
And then measurement marker.
Okay.
Is a token, template, glass bead, or any other item used by a player to mark a specific place on the board.
So just for language clarity, in the new wording of the rules, that's now referred to as a table marker. And then they specifically enumerate table markers as, a set number of pieces.
So a table marker is anytime you use any object, basically, to define a point on the table that represents something. And I believe that this is inferred that even if you put it there and don't declare it means anything, if you put it there, that's still considered a table marker. So, like, if I measure out, like, a distance and put a die down, that die becomes a table marker because I'm using it to mark a distance for myself, even if I'm not declaring it to be anything. So continue. What else do we have? Is there anything else that's defined? Okay. Does anyone have the updated
measurement device or measuring device?
I don't think all of these were broken down in the original document. I think they did it in the update. Does anyone have the...
Yeah, I'm looking at the revised wording now.
Okay. Take us through the revised wording real quick. Any differences?
Okay, so tokens and templates are pretty much exactly as Jeremy mentioned. Proxy bases are almost exactly as Jeremy mentioned. And then table marker is an item following from the following list used by a player to mark a specific place on the board that does not represent an in-game effect or a model's current placement. So these include 30 millimeter base, 40 millimeter base, 120 millimeter base, 3-inch AoE, 4-inch AoE, 5-inch AoE wall template. Measuring device is an item used to measure a specific range, such as a tape measure, a melee gauge, blast range, or war stick, which I guess is the Broken Egg branded item.
Yeah, that's what Broken Egg calls them.
Player can use any number of these to make a measurement, such as the range of an attack or a model's advance. The player can place these devices on the table when making a measurement, but cannot leave measuring devices on the table when not making the measurement.
Okay. So the only time in which you're allowed to do measurements is when you're only doing measurements. So you cannot move on to anything else until you've removed your maneuver tools.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I think that covers pretty much everything as far as what items are. So what I'd like to move into now is defining what things are. So another issue this brings up is, and I say this and I feel like a lot of people are going to immediately go, you're like conspiracy theory thinking now, is people are going to try and game the system by coming up with new things that aren't listed. And for one small example that's not very realistic is like the difference between a war stick and like Muse's measuring stick. Like a small wording like that in black and white to a judge might make a difference depending on who the judge is. And this is obviously like hyperbole because this is an exact example of two identical items that have no difference at all other than the way they're branded. But like this doesn't mean that like something won't change in the future to be a small enough. Let's say like I have war sticks. I'm like, well, I don't have war sticks. I have measure sticks. Look at my packaging. And they're like, great. So now like you have a judge that's making this ruling against somebody, which everyone knows that it should go in favor of the guy saying that it's a war stick because it is a war stick. But there's already people online making quote unquote proxy markers that are not exactly a proxy base. Like, one side has a small notch cut out of it. Well, now it's not the shape of a base. And then someone else brought up an argument, well, I'm just going to use proxies that don't have line of sight markers on them. Because they define proxies of having must have line of sight on them. Well, these aren't proxy bases then because they don't have line of sight marked. So now you're like making an argument that this isn't even a proxy base. And then we get into, okay, is it a table marker? Is it a proxy base? And these are just small arguments that could cascade into much bigger problems. And one example is people are now making like the quote-unquote war sticks, the measuring rulers, basically, with one end ending in a circle that is effectively the size of a proxy base. Well, that is clearly defined as a measuring tool. But my measuring tool has the shape of a base at the end of it. So now I have an advantage because I can measure ranges from my 50 millimeter end of my stick. That is basically a large base that's not. So that's a huge advantage to somebody, right? Like, if that's allowed. So now I basically can put proxies down and you can't. So now I have to go buy these, whatever the cost is, like $40, $50 set of measuring tools, and then I have to buy one for each base size. Because,
so what are you defining that as, that you can place them down multiple times under the new ruling?
Under the new rules, measuring tools, any number of measuring tools may be used during a measurement, but they must be removed after the measurement is completed. So once you can't do anything while you're measuring. So basically if you're like, I'm going to pre-measure my movement.
Device?
Yeah, measuring device. Yeah, okay, measuring device, sorry. Did I say measurement tool? I bet I did.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So measuring device. So I have a measuring device here, and I get to measure like melee ranges and stuff from the end of mine, where you just end in a rectangle, so like it doesn't help you for measuring your melee range at weird angles. And you're like, well, crap. And so there's stuff like that which is immediately causing an issue. So if you call that a proxy base now you're telling people they can't use their measurement tools or devices that they bought online. And if you let them use it the way that they want to use it, now they have a huge advantage over everyone that doesn't have those.
Right, and there's a hypothetical situation you could have here where this is, loopholing through the measuring device wording, which is ambiguous, to try and circumvent the table marker wording. The problem isn't with measuring devices, but if you get more rigorous in defining, like, okay, so we don't want you pre-measuring table markers in that manner, so the more rigorous wording is going to be outlining the only specific products you can use. I think that's a really undesirable state, but it also cuts off like bases connected by string or whatever, and the problem is not with the measuring device wording. The problem is with the table marker wording, not letting players measure in a way that they're accustomed to.
Well, because the table marker wording states that the following items are allowed as table markers: 30 millimeter, 40 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 120, 3, 4, and 5 AoE wall template.
Right, and you're only ever allowed to have one.
Okay, so table markers being proxy bases and anything to use to mark spots on the table, right?
Well, no, because the table markers are defined as the specific thing, so you can't have the two things connected by a string because they're not that as a table marker.
Okay. So, wait a second. So two things connected by string cannot be a table marker?
No, they cannot be, because the table marker says it must be one of these things.
Okay.
And
right, but the wording on measurement devices is ambiguous and could potentially allow that.
Right, because it's not defined as a table marker, therefore it's either a measurement tool or nothing, right? Because those are the other things. because it's either a proxy model, a measurement tool, or a table marker. Those are like our three options, right? So as long as whatever you're using as a quote-unquote proxy base does not fit the exact restrictions of a table marker, it's not. Therefore, it has to either be not restricted because it's not on the list, or it's a measurement tool.
So by proxy base, you mean measuring device, right?
No, I mean table marker.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to keep it clear because the wording,
I'm doing a terrible job of it.
Matters.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well,
it does.
And I think this goes back to the whole point, right? So, like, whether you agree or disagree with the intention of the rule, the fact of the matter is that we have to have this conversation to define terms before we can get to the intention or the thought process that Privateer Press has released behind this. So if we obviously have to do this, obviously there has to be stuff that gets cleaned up. But thankfully, that's why this is all in CID, is because they're watching very closely. They're monitoring the feedback very, very closely. So I think, like, obviously, like, even though that there's this initial kind of sticker shock, I feel like there's an opportunity here for us as a community to kind of sit down and say, okay, we need to better define terms. We need to better define implements. We need to better define exactly what the intention is. Because I think if we can learn what the intention is, we can learn how to adapt that to the game. And I think that's exactly what the CID process is going to allow us to do.
Well, it's not around terms, though, is the thing. It's not around, like, the terms that constitute a measuring device or a table marker. Like,
well, you literally just said it was, though.
No, I mean that's the issue. The issue you're seeing is people don't like how table markers are being treated and are
gamers are gamers. They're attempting to manipulate the system and find a loop. Yeah, we get that.
Exactly. The issue is actually the intent of this rule and the kind of behavior it's meant to stop. This debate about table markers and measuring devices didn't exist a week ago. No one outside of Privateer Press would have foreseen this as a major debate because there wasn't need for one.
Right, because you could measure anything at any time.
Right, you're just not restricted. So it's not that I think these are super important topics that, like, in and of themselves, like, the definition of these things is obviously irrelevant if this rule isn't there. It's extremely important if it is there. Because what are we as a community? We're a bunch of min-maxing nerds that do nothing but break numbers for, like, a hobby. So when you give them a word problem, they're going to do the same thing to it. So if you cannot write intention into a rule that is objective, it's not really possible, at least with our language, in my opinion. So when you say, hey guys, you can't do X, and you write down what X is on a piece of paper, well, when there's 20,000 people that do nothing but break rules for a living, basically, that's what they're going to do. They're going to find the letter of the law and break it, because our rule system is built around letter of the law. Like, that's why we choose to play this game, because the words mean something, as we're, like, other companies like Games Workshop, for an example, has a lot of intended wording. Like, you kind of read it the way you think it's meant to be read, and that's how you play it. And because there's a lot of ambiguous wording, because there's not consistent formatted verbiage. And so we choose to play this game for that reason. So if it says a table marker, which is, like, for an example, a 50mm proxy base would be a table marker, but I put a little V incision in the edge of mine. Well, now it's not a 50mm proxy base, which would be considered as a table marker. It's either nothing or it's a measurement tool, which means I can now use them in ways that you can't use yours, because yours are exactly what is defined as a table marker. And there's even people online selling them with, like, little ovals cut out of the back already. I've seen the websites where people are selling these, and this is still in CID. Like, where are we going to be at in 2 months?
Well, and
anybody who makes purchases based on things that have already changed, like 2 days after, are morons. Yeah, they're morons. Let's just.
Well, like, let's talk about the overall shape of the game, what pre-measuring looks like in the game, and what the impact of this change is. Because I think, like, that gets us out of the territory of quibbling about, what a table marker or a measuring device is, and gets us into, like, what we actually care about, which is how pre-measuring functions in Warmachine.
So I think we've done, like, obviously pointing out the issues with creating a rule like this and the complexity required to make it function as intended, because I believe it was intended to just straight up prevent measuring more than, like, I think they're adding the verbiage of only using one proxy base because that's the only way they can think of to prevent you measuring more than one model at a time. Because if you, for example, if you said, well, you can only measure one model at a time, okay, well, I'm going to put a large base proxy over here and say that my model might in theory get over there, but I'm actually using it to measure a different model, like, and stuff like that. Like the old, I'm going to check my control range and do it so that I can check to see if this model has charge range. Like, basically that, but just totally abuse the letter of the law again. So I think the only way they can come up with to stop you from doing that is to say you can only have one table marker or proxy base at a time.
I think that's where this becomes precarious. Privateer Press has already stated they don't really care much for weaponized geometry, which is why they originally allowed in pre-measuring. And then now that we've taken away the weaponized geometry and then just changed it to weaponized pre-measuring, essentially, right? Okay, yeah, fair, whatever. Like, now that we've done that, they're like, well, okay, maybe this has gone a bit too far. This kind of goes back to the point I was making in terms of, like, they may not be able to write an intention into the rule, but I think something that can happen, and I hope is a benefit of CID, is they tell us what their intention is to the process, and they already have to some degree, but they tell us what their intention for the rule is, and then we as a community can figure out the best way to implement that with PP's guide, right? And so that's actually what the hope is. I think when we were talking about terminology, I was using that to illustrate a point. I was not using that as my point. And it illustrates the fact that I feel like this is the part of the conversation that needs to happen, because identifying what pre-measuring looks like now versus what pre-measuring looks like in the future and the impact that has on the game, I think is essentially at the core of this. And that's the thing that needs to be discovered.
Right. So there's a categorical difference between, using the term weaponized is kind of like hot button, but like using trigonometry versus using bases to measure, there's a categorical difference in how that information pans out between the two players. Using extensive trigonometry or geometry is only visible to one player, and they cannot possibly obtain consent from their opponent if they're doing a bunch of head math to figure something out. Versus if you proxy base something, that information is totally transparent to both players, and you can receive agreement in advance without committing to a move and then having acrimony later about whether that move was legal.
Okay, I would like to bring up the point that we're moving into a new topic that I'm going to call the problem. So basically, we're going to talk about why someone obviously thinks that pre-measuring is a problem and what we think about that, or why we think they might think it's a problem and why we might think it's a problem or not a problem. So that's going to be our topic for the next few talking points.
Yeah, and the problem extends beyond just legality of measurement. The problem also extends to how the game plays and the kinds of decisions you're making. Because, the different situations of measurement rules, they give rise to totally different game shapes and what you are strategizing on and economizing on as a player.
I cannot express enough into words how frustrating it is to believe that effectively pre-measuring the way I use it, which might be excessive or inexcessive in someone's opinion, is because if that goes away, I use it primarily to show my opponents what I'm going to do and to allow them to critique my use of maneuvering. And so, like, for an example, like if I'm playing Strakov 1, which is a crazy threat range, weird vector, long distance caster, that is nearly impossible to play without pre-measuring. Like, the distance problem, like I can judge distances generally better than anyone I play. Like, I've only played, I think, 2 people ever that judged distances at the naked eye better than I did. And I'm not trying to brag or anything, like, that's just the experience I've had. So in Mark II, I would frustrate the hell out of people by just putting my models a quarter-inch out of threat range. And they would just sit there and traumatize themselves over if they could get to me or not. And they never could, and they lost games on failing charges. So that was just like a tool I used constantly to win games. And so now I know that your opponent is always hoping that you fail. Right? Like that's just the mindset you have to have, right? Like that's as a competitive game. They're hoping that you fail. They're not going to like go out of their way to make you fail or anything that they're not supposed to do. But if I'm trying to like walk out of difficult terrain with an overrun movement and then charge someone at a weird angle because what I'm actually trying to charge is out of line of sight because of like a cloud or a forest or obstructing models, and then actually get melee range on them and go through it and like kill their caster or important model or whatever it happens to be. And I do all of this without pre-measuring. Every single time I move, we're basically going to have an argument. Because either I cheated myself because I care more about observing the integrity of the game than winning, or I'm going to cheat you because I want to win more than I care about in like keeping the integrity of the game. And I cannot count.
That's going to be the case from your opponent's perspective for sure, because the very paradigm of how you're allowed to measure sets up an adversarial relationship in terms of what their intentions are toward your measurement.
Right. And there's so many times like I actively cheat myself on like fractions of an inch. I intentionally measure it short every time I move something really close because I'd rather fail than cheat. So there's so many times I do that. And then I look at across the table, and I'm not kidding, this happened to me in a game, and I almost walked out of the tournament. I drove 4 hours to get there, where I'm doing all these extremely precise, like I declare my intents, like, well, your model moved within 6 of LeConte. I measured the 6. I'm like, all right, you triggered Watcher. I'm going to attempt to move this diffuser around this model and block like your like whatever distance to get another model in. Like, this is what I'm going to do. And so I'll tell them exactly what I'm going to do, and I'll measure it with a proxy without moving my model. And then I'll get there and like I'm like, tell you what, I'm going to measure it again just to make sure. And I pick up my proxy and I do it again. And I measure this whole thing over again. I'm like, do you agree with what I just did is legal? And they're like, yeah, 100%, because I watched you do it twice. And at no time did I do anything but cheat myself. And they're like, okay. So then I move my model to on top of the proxy, and then I like hit the clock. And there's so many times I do stuff like that, and the same person I played, that same person I measured my thing twice for, like, saved me the game on a Watcher move. And I watch him quick measure and almost move double what he was supposed to get his caster to my caster. I literally almost threw my dice on the floor. I was so mad. And it's like, so many of these things are like just not possible because I could just pre-measure his walk and just show him that he's out, and then we can agree on it and be done, and it's not an issue. So it's stuff like that is now impossible. Like, there was more pre-measure in Mark II than would be allowed by this document, in my opinion. Because the distances I'm worried about are not linear, like this to this. Like, I don't need pre-measuring to tell me you're out of 12. I need pre-measuring for stuff like, I'm going to move around this forest and then, like, get into melee with this guy on, like, this super close, like, fraction of an inch move that's going to change the game. Like, stuff like that is what I care about. And that will become completely impossible, which, in my opinion, we might as well go back to Mark II. Like, and that's an extremely passionate opinion of mine, and a lot of people disagree with that.
No, yeah, I 100% share your opinion, and I know, like, among competitive players, we're not alone in this.
Like, I'm almost throwing things at the table. I'm like so freaking out about this. I'm trying to stay level-headed. And I know that they're not trying to, like, obviously PP doesn't want to ruin their game. They don't want to screw us. They want to make us mad. They want us to have the best game possible. And that's what they're working to do. And I don't see the games that are causing an issue enough to implement a dramatic rule change like this.
Well, let's go into that then. Like, what's the intention for Privateer Press that the developers have stated? And there's several different intentions, not all of which seem identical to me, but they have, there's a variety of intentions which have been stated.
The roots in the same garden kind of thing. So things that I've heard, and I've tried to read the forums, but I've been really busy this week, so it's been hard. But they say things like, the people pre-measuring their entire turns we want to stop. They never intended for people to measure, like, I want to see where my model can move to. And then they're like, yeah, that's fine. Put a proxy down, see where you can move to, measure whatever you want. And it's like, they never intended to, like, where can that model move? And then if my caster moves here, is he going to be in control? And also be within walk and power range of my solo, and also walk and battle range of my choir, and also be within walk and repair range of my solo next turn that's going to run. And, like, also my caster is going to be within the Hierophant's, like, walk and harmonious thing. And also, after he moves, he's going to be within the +2 range ability. And, like, and it just keeps stacking these pre-measures on pre-measures on pre-measures. And I'm like, sure, like, you could pre-measure all that stuff, or you could just know that you're in because most of these distances aren't that close. Like, how many distances every turn do you even need to use anything but a tape measure for? And tape measure is the least accurate form of measurement we have. And I don't even need to use anything but a pre-measure to know 100% I have ranges for these things.
So to approach this from a little different lens, obviously, Brandon, you, Alex, you guys are WTC team members. You're very high-level players. So I would imagine most of the time at a tournament, you're going to play against other high-level players, right? Like, that's the way it's going to work. So I would imagine in those games, you would see those kind of behaviors far less. So from someone who's typically an XM1 player, I can say that the use of proxies and pre-measurings, and maybe it's because I, like so many others, we're all tryhards, like we want to do well. So, like, I've seen this bevy of proxy bases hit the table. I've seen incredibly sloppy game states because of this. And, like, some of the things that I've seen is, like, we'll put down a proxy base to flag off a model, right? And then someone will drop a measuring implement, like a 30-millimeter base, and then another 30-millimeter base. And so they'll get this chain going where they have, like, all these different devices on the table. And then I've literally seen people, like, charge through their own proxy base. Like, that is actually a model. But because there's so much stuff on the table, they have just lost track of what everything is on the table. And, like, I've seen that happen because I've seen players try and do that against me because they'll just forget. And I don't think anybody is maliciously intending to do any wrong, but it's just when you get so much stuff on the table, like, it leads to a sloppier game. And on top of, like, watching somebody, like, drop out all this stuff and it gets really, really confusing, and then, like, activations start getting blurry, and, like, on top of all these other things, then we're starting to deal with, like, well, is this really a model or is this just a measuring implement? And I'm using the term measuring implement so I can separate between a proxy, which represents a model, and a measuring implement.
Is it a table marker?
Yeah, is it a table marker? Thank you. That's the right term. Thank you, Alex. And so, like, that's what I'm kind of, like, that's what I've seen. And granted, you don't see it a lot. You don't, in fact, you see it very rarely. But I have seen it enough to, like, cause things. Well, you know what, Brandon? A wonderful example. In the last tournament I played in, I had to call you over to make measurements, I think, 3 times in my last game on the day?
But one of them was very close. The other two, I felt like you were just basically saying, I don't want, not in, like, a bad way or anything, but I don't want to say if this is in or out because this is very important, so I just rather someone that doesn't care tell me, which is the same thing we brought up earlier, yeah.
Yeah, and on top of that, too, like, we had some it wasn't maybe the cleanest movements possible. And then, like, so when it all gets down to it, like, eventually I just kind of got to a point where I'm like, Judge, like, I don't want to make this call because this is already becoming contentious because I'm getting confused and he's not, like, my opponent could have been maybe a little bit more vigilant in declaring what was going where. And so, like, so I can understand the counterbalance to this. Like, I understand from a high-level player's perspective. You're like, I throw down 75 proxy bases a turn and my opponents never have a problem with it. Well, that's probably very true because of the definition of your opposition. But if you're like me, and sometimes, like, we're all playing in a bunch of tryhards, like, the reason why we're not at the top tables is because we do make mistakes. And so this, to me, can help to clarify those mistakes. So I actually am kind of, like, in between. Like, part of me wants to see it scaled back a little bit, but I don't want to see the ability to make accurate measurements go away. Does that make sense?
I think what you're coming down to at that point is a question of last recourse, which is to say a judge call making an absolute determination. about, somebody made an error and moved through something. That's supposed to be a model. What's there then is a sort of sloppy play state and reckoning backwards from that. And if you say, that was supposed to be a model, and they're like, oh, I goofed, but they've already moved their piece and, there's no going back or whatever, like, you have to call a judge at that point. And like Brandon was talking about, I'd rather, shortchange myself than cheat is, I would take that position in that case, like, oh, I guess you're right. I'll move back to the proxy base or attempt to figure it out or call a judge and say this is what happened and figure it out from there.
Usually if like someone makes a mistake at that point, I usually just say, I'm going to put this here. If you think it shouldn't be there, move it to where you think it should be. And then I'm good with that because I fucked up. Like, that's my bad. Like,
yeah, that's a matter of judge policy at that point and where you should land at the last recourse. Like, I don't necessarily think that has to have implications for all measurements per se. And I think like the proxy base section of the rules actually does help define that a little bit. But like, yeah, I think that's judge policy.
Right, but the judge policy doesn't have to come into effect if the behavior is not present, because people like monkey see, monkey do, right? So they see all of the streams that happen with high-level games that like have a million proxy bases, but they don't play as much, they don't do it as much, so they're sloppy, they don't do it as well, and so it leads to bad game states more often. If you get rid of the cause of the behavior, you don't have to have judge policy.
Right.
So if you eliminate it at the source, it just doesn't go. It just doesn't happen.
Certainly, if you remove their ability to place proxy bases that are not models, it certainly gets easier to not trip over your own like mess, basically. When it comes to stuff like that, if you can't keep track of your models and like all your proxies and where your stuff is supposed to be and still perform your turn at a level that is acceptable to the rules, I think that is more a problem of you are trying to do things that you don't even understand. And if you're trying to do that to like because you think pre-measuring excessively will improve your play, I don't see how that helps. And this is again another topic that we'll bring up later. Is why like what is like the difference in like play levels that also represents immediately into like pre-measuring and stuff. I don't know. I don't see I guess if people are going online and seeing that, oh, these people are doing X and look at all the proxy bases they have, so I'm clearly just not pre-measuring enough, and they're doing things like that, I don't see where they're getting that from. Like, there are lots of video games with lots and lots of proxy bases and pre-measuring and stuff. There's also a lot of games without. I go to these conventions, and even if I don't make top tables very often, like hardly ever, but I go to the tables and I watch these games. I run a lot of tournaments. The final tables, with exception to like people that just don't have models that fit in places, don't use excessive proxy bases, like exclusively, especially. Like, sure, there's the random guy that does, but for the most part, like the quote unquote really good players, which I don't even include myself in by a long shot, are just playing the game normally, and if anything else, it's the people just below them that I think are using the excessive bases. But again, I think we're also getting okay. I definitely agree that people that are trying to excel, like reach the next level, basically like going from intermediate to competitive or casual to intermediate, is definitely difficult and frustrating, and especially if you're playing on time more often than you normally do, and you're trying to do excessive pre-measuring and doing very technical maneuvers that you're not accustomed to, you're definitely going to hit those problems. But those are problems that are probably going to just be compounded even harder if you're not pre-measuring stuff, because you have no chance to realize that you just walked into your own charge lane. Like, you don't realize those things in advance.
Right, but then you see, oh, hey, I can't move there, and then you learn from it. It's not the game state is invalidated. It becomes a learning experience for the player. It becomes a learning experience for the player as opposed to, oh, well, I put down 4 proxy bases, and oh, I can't move through my line of bases. I thought it was a flag. Yada yada yada.
Right, and that's why I say this is a matter of last recourse and judges at events. Like, when you're talking illegal game state, that's what you're talking about.
Right, but if you don't have this, then you never have that happen, and then the already overtaxed judge doesn't have to deal with potential judge calls.
Except
It's not the top end players that normally have like a lot of judge calls. It's like intermediate like players trying to break in who are like super tryharding and trying to get out every little advantage, who don't know all of the little ins and outs. That's the other guys.
No, yeah, I'll 100% agree there. Having been there myself, yes, I absolutely agree. Also, I don't necessarily think that these situations have gone up. I think due to the advent of pre-measuring and what it is possible to pre-measure, it's gone down.
Well, for this specific case, this has created a whole new type of judge call that didn't exist before.
Sure, I definitely agree with Ritchie that this specific situation of specifically moving through your own model because you didn't realize it was actually there, but that's more of a... So I agree with that this is a problem that can be fixed by this rule. I also think that this problem can be fixed by cleaner play, and I'm not saying cleaner play is in, like, remember your stuff. I'm saying that if that model that is a proxy base standing in the middle of the table is supposed to be a model, why isn't it that model? Like, so they moved the proxy base and everything. There's like, my model's going to move there and pick up their model and put it on the side. They're doing it wrong. They should be replacing the proxy or stacking the model on the proxy to represent that the model has actually made that movement. If they're just leaving massive amounts of proxy bases on the table, and it's not because the model doesn't fit, and it's just because they were lazy and didn't move their models, I 100% agree that can be an issue in tournaments. And that is just an issue in the game. And so this rule would fix that. So an example of what I would say in that situation is I think this is the rules that we're talking about right now is a large overkill for that. And it could be fixed by just saying, what if when you go to move a pre-measured movement, you must move the model to the proxy if it will fit? Like, you can't just leave proxies down counting as everything. Like, obviously that's just not smart for either player. Like, your opponent's going to get confused, you're going to confuse, you're going to make mistakes. That can be fixed by just following through with your movements. Like, that doesn't mean that... I know I'm fighting for pre-measuring here, so obviously I'm slanted, but that can be fixed by just saying follow through with your movements because you're creating issues actively. And maybe the people just aren't familiar enough with pre-measuring at that level to realize that, but...
That keeps going back to the CID process. Like, hopefully maybe something like that is the ultimate end benefit of this CID process. Like, I see this as like a growing pain to go like, okay, well, how do we clean this up, right? Like, how do we stop it? And then we'll, they release that, then let's, like, the community will work on it from there is the hope. So I am very pro CID. So I'm probably looking at this from rose-colored glasses going, no. Going to be fine, guys. Don't worry. Who's got 2 thumbs up and loves CID? No. It's this guy. Yeah. It's Seabass.
I love CID. See, this is amazing that the steps we've made over the last year, even not even a year, 8 months, 10 months maybe, that we have community integrated development to where they can drop this bombshell on us, see how we react, immediately change it, and then fine-tune it to what both the community and the company wants as a whole and make everyone happy. That is amazing. Like, that's hands down making huge progress. And if this came out to be like basically becomes like a former judge document saying, hey, move your models to where they're supposed to be if at all possible, and don't use excessive proxy bases because you're like the judge can tell you have to clear your board state if it becomes excessive, like stuff like that. I'm super fine with that. That should probably already be in there and can be an issue. Because like when you've got people stumbling over yourself, like Ritchie pointed out, that is creating unclean play, which is the opposite of what pre-measure should be doing.
Right. And I agree 100% that it should be a judge issue, because at that point you're not talking like clearly delineatable rules with boundaries. What you're talking about is players making mistakes and players not playing properly. At that point, you're already in the domain of soft rules. And I think it takes a soft rule to answer that.
Right, well, we're actually in the domain, because I have to respectfully disagree, we're actually in the domain of talking about a behavior that leads to judge mistakes. So if you can curb the behavior, it's like treating you're like treating the symptoms and I'm treating the root cause. If I can eliminate the root cause, then I can eliminate all judge calls forever about that issue. That's what my initial end point of the game of this particular point is if I can do this, I can stop all future judge calls. Yours, you have to deal with each individual judge call in the moment.
I don't know where you stand on this. I feel like you're on the side of this change should happen, which is totally fine. Like, we definitely need people on both sides.
Right. I do want some sort of limiting. I'm not sure if I agreed with like the specific wording, how they have it laid out. I think it needs to be cleaned up. I was part of the CID process for the Grimkin, and a lot of stuff gets changed. So especially when you're looking at like final wordings and like looking at minutiae of definitions in week 2 of CID process, I think it's better if you look at it more as like a holistic approach. This is the intent, and this is what the current rule does here. What can we tell them to do that will make the actual printed rule match the intent, which is what we did with the Grimkin.
Yeah, and the reason I'm against I brought up the exact wording thing is because I don't know that it's actually possible for a rule like that to define objects and not list every type of object and like constantly update it when new products are released and like constantly harass everyone about what kind of things they're using on the table. Is I don't know if it's actually possible to draw all those things out and properly restrict them without having constant judge calls made like there at the event kind of stuff to actually restrict it properly to make sure everyone's playing the same game basically. And I just think that it's an unnecessary rule in the way they've designed it. And I'm not saying that something doesn't need change. Like we've already talked about several things I'd be very happy with seeing a change to.
Yeah, but I think at this point we are definitely diving a little deep down the rabbit hole.
Sure.
So do you want to return to like sort of outlining the intent of the rule and like
I think everyone
from the developer's perspective?
I think everyone understands the intent. At least we don't know why the intent is what it is, but I think it's pretty obvious what they want us to stop doing. At least because unless like just we're going to completely rewrite this thing, which I would be happy with, but they clearly don't want us having a bunch of proxy bases on the table that aren't required to play the game, and they don't want us measuring everything forever. And I don't think
I'm just going to go by the rules here in the actual rule book.
Okay.
A player can measure any distance at any reason, any time.
Right, which is the rule that they're talking about changing in the process, which is why it's in community integrated development.
Well, they're not talking about,
as far as their organized play is concerned.
they're not talking about changing that rule though. They're talking about adding another one for competitive play.
Right, as far as their organized play is concerned, they're modifying it.
Well, I mean, like that's absolutely the case. It's super weird though, because you get into you know what I think is the root of the issue, which is if you use the tournament packet, you are playing a game that is less suited to competitive play than the rulebook has printed.
I actually, if and again, we're talking early CID stuff, this is probably going to change a lot. But if a rule very similar to this made it through, I would 100% agree with that statement. I'm agreeing with you, assuming that a wording like what we have or anything very similar to it made it through a CID into the SteamRoller packet, it would be 100% less competitive than playing a game without a scenario.
Yeah. And it's like, for me as a tournament player, like, the WTC would be the last competitive event I played in if that rule passed.
I might, if it went through like it is now, I might just drop out of the WTC. Like, that's, if it made it through, I would just be like, well, there's no...
Well, I mean, the WTC doesn't have to be SteamRoller.
Sure, exactly, but we'll get to that as well. I don't want to hit that yet. So I think we are definitely getting out. We'll talk about these more. So, basically the problems that we are fixing. Ritchie did bring up a very good point. There is people that are stumbling over themselves because they can't even handle the stuff they're doing, and it's not limited to new or intermediate players. Like, I'm sure there's competitive players out there that make mistakes because they're overwhelming themselves with information.
It's also a fairly new concept.
It is
Pre-measure in the game.
Mm-hmm. Because it actually so Jeremy brought up an interesting point. The actual wording in the rulebook just says you can measure distances at any time. We're all kind of still playing from an assumption in Mark II where they stated you can put proxy bases wherever you want.
There's also no rule stating that distance has to be an imperial unit. and measure any distance for any reason, that wording is totally inclusive of measuring a 30 millimeter base. Why? Not because the model's moving there, but because, fuck you, that's why.
So is there any other problems before we move into other things? Because we definitely, I think, are ready to move into other things. But before we do, is there anything else that is an active problem with pre-measuring other than like people tripping over themselves because they're doing too much? I know some people have talked about that they sit there and watch their opponents basically like automate their entire turn for like a long period of time, and they basically just sit there and watch. We're talking about, and the reason that this annoys me more than anything else is we're talking about the steamroller packet, which is generic death clock time. It's no longer generic time turns, it's generic death clock. So you can't even claim that your opponent is stalling for time pre-measuring one or two models excessively. It's literally their time to use. You're not allowed to complain about their time. If they lose because of clock, then they lost because of clock. If they didn't, then they didn't. Like it's black and white. That's why we love it. So I don't think that's a viable argument.
And it's also not like you're sitting there for infinite number of turns either. I think they tried to correct for too many things at once and just kind of overlapped on some things.
Well, that's getting into their intentions. And they've got, we can get into this now, but I see at least 3 stated intentions behind this rule change, none of which have overlap.
Okay, let's finish up this, and I'd like to move into that, actually. The time, I think the fixing people's time is completely unbased and has no concept of actual reality, because beyond this, all of the you can do this but can't do that stuff, and can't keep your measurements on the table, so you have to restart every time you try and do anything, makes it actually take longer, and these people are going to 100% pre-measure their very important turns like assassinations and just like extremely important movements like a butcher's 3 feet turn and stuff. They're going to pre-measure absolutely everything about it that they can, because you lose the game if you mess up. So it's worth sacrificing time. It's worth sacrificing attrition. You have to get this done right. So doing that, it's just going to make people take even longer to go into the tank to accomplish these great feats of complicated movement. It's just going to be more confrontational when you try and do these little incremental movements, because you can't guarantee that you're doing it correctly for them, that you can do now. And you're just going to take longer because of how many times you have to remeasure everything. And I don't know, it just seems like that's like it actually will create more of a time issue by letting this through.
No, yeah, the time issue, I mean, I think this is one of the 3 stated intentions, but the longest turn I ever took in my life, and the first time I ever death clocked myself, was pre-planning a complex turn in Mark II. I thought I had an assassination run on Lich, and my turn 3 took me literally 45 minutes. Because I had to go in the tank and remeasure so much stuff, and my opponent just had to sit there for 45 minutes. It took forever.
Yeah, and if you had just had pre-measuring, you could have measured it out for like 2 minutes and be like, this is going to work or not, and then you just hit the gas and go.
No, yeah, that turn would have taken 15 minutes tops in how the game has been played up to this point.
Okay, so that's it for problems that this would fix. Let's go into intent and finish off intent finally. So what are the 3 things that you think this was, intended to deal with? Like, as far as like the reason they're trying to make this happen.
I guess I would list it at number 3 because it's only been alluded to indirectly in the CID thread, but is your opponent sitting
for long periods of time?
Yeah, and the turns are generally taking longer. I think experientially that's not the case, but I also don't have like a canonical body of evidence to cite for that. And I'll also bring up, there's also no canonical body of evidence that can be brought up to assert the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no evidence that this is happening or not happening. My personal experience is it's not. Turns are people may plan multiple permutations of a turn and take several turns longer, but generally I think the game plays fast.
Okay. I 100% agree. The game definitely plays faster, but a lot of that is automatically attributed to model bloat. Like, the quantity of models played with in Mark III are noticeably smaller. So that's going to lend to games playing faster, obviously. Not having to precisely measure an entire movement's charge, or unit's charge. When, like, you have 10 reach guys charging their 10 reach guys, and they're all at weird angles because they just charge your other dudes. It's like making sure you're not triggering free strikes while 20 models interact with each other's melee ranges, while you can't measure anything in Mark II, was so complex and annoying and tedious that we don't deal with hardly at all anymore, because people just don't play enough guys to make it that bad. Also, like we said, like the pre-measuring is just going to make it take less time, I think. For the people that are measuring out their entire turns, like turn after turn after turn, like just doing every model as a proxy before I move kind of thing. Not like, just despite Death Clock alone, we're talking the argument would be, well, I guess if you're not playing Death Clock or time turns, you can do that because you're not on a clock at all, so you can do all these things. But the problem is we're not talking about casual games, we're talking about steamroller games, which have to be timed because of the rules format. And if we're not following the timed rules, then who's going to follow the pre-measure rules? So it's not applicable to a casual game anyway. So if there's some guy sitting in a store with him and his buddy takes 3-hour turns because he pre-measures his entire turn, Steamroller Pack's not going to help that guy. So I don't understand what that's actually helping.
So I think that touches on the third intention, which is the one that I saw in a lot of their responses late in the second thread. But the second intention is to cut down on the pre-measure all your models on your turn kind of situation, and that we've talked about a bit. Like it's a self-punishing behavior. Like, if you embark on pre-measuring your entire turn, yeah, it costs you time. And more than that, if you pre-measure literally every model for a given set of things that are going to happen, if that set of things involves rolling dice and an unexpected event occurs, you've spent a lot of time that's wasted that you have to redo. But the only person bearing the cost in a tournament environment is you. Like you're the one who wasted that time, and now you have to replan, and it costs you toward a direct loss condition in the game.
Yeah. And also, just on top of this, just pre-measuring aside even, if their whole concept is people complaining about having, and I don't know if they're getting a bunch of complaints, I'm just assuming, because why else would it be an issue, is if they're having all these problems having this time go into people pre-measuring everything, is like, what if you just play slow people? Like, we have many people in my meta that don't even pre-measure, really. They throw the ruler out and stuff, and they do what they want, but they don't do a bunch of proxy-based stuff just because we don't have enough models to justify it. And they take hour and 15-minute turns. They refuse to play on clocks. Not kidding, I watched them play one game for 6 hours. I'm like, it's Warmachine, guys. This should not be happening. It's Warmachine. Your turn should be maybe 20 minutes. Maybe. And they literally take 4 times that. And I'm like, okay. And so, you're not stopping this from happening. People take a long time. I played against a guy who took a 48-minute second turn and scored 0 control points. I was like, so I'm now going to go get a sandwich because this game's over. That's the best thing ever. Why are you mad people are throwing games to you, basically? I don't. If it's an aspect of the game's not fun, well, again, you're only adjusting the steamroller rules, which is already heavily moderated on how much time they're allowed to do this for. So it doesn't actually save anything from happening.
Right, and if you're concerned about the casual player's experience, you're actually not touching their experience at all or making competition any more appealing to them. This rule totally doesn't fall on that realm.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of casual games that get played with the steamroller packet. There's a lot of that's the most common way that people get played. When you go to a game store, even if it's not a tournament, it's just local game night, you'll see recon, you'll see boobs, you'll see outwell, you'll see whatever. You'll see those.
So I totally agree that you do see people playing the steamroller scenarios, but are all of them playing on Death Clock? Are all of them playing with Judge Packet? Are all of them following the letter of the rules? Like in Mark II, if you forgot to dig up your Helldiver, it died. Like, are they playing with every aspect of the game? Are they playing two-list selection and they're playing, like, deploy on your clock? Like, because if they're not doing those things, then they're not going to be following the judge document for pre-measuring. They're just going to say, I need to do this so we know where my model is. I'm just going to do it. And then if they are doing all of those things, then I argue they're not casual players. They're tournament players. Like, if every game you play is to the letter of the law of a tournament, it doesn't matter if you're not at an event or not. Like, you're a competitive player, in my opinion.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. But but that's their stated intent is why they want to put it in the Steamroller packet is because they recognize a lot of people play with the Steamroller rules because there's a lot of players. It's like because I know like personally, if somebody asks me like, "Hey, do you want to play a Rumble game? Can we play one of these? Can we play one of these instead? Because those are garbage."
Right, and this is something I had when I was playing in the 40K community is, yeah, that's absolutely the case, that people are going to practice as they play, and practice as they play shows up on, like, you know, weekday game night or whatever. You know,
Right.
You come playing Steamroller as it's written, etc., practicing for the tournament environment, and that proliferates throughout a community that has competitive players to have everyone eventually playing on scenarios so they're equipped to play the game as it shapes up in their local environment. The issues Brandon mentioned, though, like, still absolutely hold true, as does the issue of, okay, so you're putting this rule in place, but there's no arbiter and there's no consequences.
Right. So just like when you play on time turns or death clock and you're just playing like when I play around the shop, and maybe I'm the only person that does this, but when I'm playing a new guy or a newer or a casual-ish player, I'm like, hey, let's play a Steamroller scenario, and they're like, I guess, and like we put down the Steamroller scenario and we deploy on our clocks and we use the death clock during the game, but when our clock goes off we just keep playing. And I'm just like, just so you know, like, just so you understand, like, this is the amount of time you would be normally allotted in a tournament so that you can kind of start admeaning yourself to this situation, like, get used to the concept that this happens, and they don't freak out when they get on the clock, and they get to play the game still. We get to finish the game, and we have a good game. And I make sure that we play, like, to a decent level. And so they're getting the experience they need, but we're not, like, hardcoring the rules like by any means, because like shocking their system and getting them to play to the strictest letter of the law in every single game is the worst way to get them to come to tournaments. Hi, Karl. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Karl.
Nice, good job. Round of applause.
So the area of the third intention, which I think is the biggest and most contentious one, and the one where I've seen the most pushback against the community from the staff, is, and players, by the way, that are chiming in on the CID threads about pre-measuring are almost all chiming in on reason number one, which is wasting your time. Well, they're actually wasting their time. But reason number three is, intention number three is, well, we wrote this rule about pre-measuring, but we didn't anticipate how it was used, and we don't like how it's being used. We don't like people getting...
Oh my god, that pushes like all of my buttons.
I know. We don't like how people are... We don't like how people are pre-measuring, and we want there to be risk and uncertainty in measurement.
Yeah, that one's from Souls, right?
Souls and Pagani and Hungerford.
Everyone has said it. Like they are either representing each other fairly and all agreeing, or they actually all agree, or they all hate it and some horrible mind controlling Cellfix master is making them say it. But it doesn't really matter. It's the third one, yeah. As Alex can tell you, the third option is the best because the third option comes first, and then there's the second one, and then we go back to the third one for a whole new reason. So yeah, the third option there is it's not being used the way we intended. Basically, they open Pandora's box and you're like, it's going to be great. Everyone's going to get these cool presents. And you're like, oh my God. Like, and they like hit the 9/11 apocalypse and they're like, I don't know what to do. Like, this is way out of hand and it's going to keep getting worse. And like, sure. But like, I go around and I talk to people and I can't remember a single time I've met someone who said, "Man, I really wish you couldn't measure anything," or "Pre-measuring is bad," or "Pre-measuring is stupid," after they have given an honest try to pre-measuring games. Almost exclusively across the board. I was a big fighter of bringing pre-measuring to Warmachine. I 100% was against it. 100%. You can go back and listen to the podcast where I said, "This is stupid. They're ruining the game." I said that.
So you mean after a proposed change, you didn't like it, but after you tried it for a little while, you find it was a bad idea? Not a bad idea?
First game I played, I said I'm sorry to my opponent that I ever said I dislike pre-measuring. I was like, literally, wow, this is awesome.
I think it was a game with Ryan I was playing. I just kept pre-measuring everything in second ed. I'm like, you see, you can already do it.
Yeah.
He was like, oh, I guess I'm wrong.
Ryan was like, pre-measuring is going to ruin the game. And he's like, what do you mean? It's you can just measure the command range of your units. And I'm like, you can do that. And he's like, well, then I could just measure the melee range on this thing. He's like, you can do that. He's like, well, measure the command range of my warcasters. You can do that because there's no caster with a command higher than their control. And he's like, well, and he just kept listing all these things. You can literally pre-measure every single thing you just said.
I think I spent a 3-hour game with him just going, all right, I'm pre-measuring this.
It's I'm going to check to see if this dude's in command range. And you're like, you can't do that. Ryan, you could totally do that.
3 inches to the zone, which I know was 12 inches, so...
If only I knew if I was in charge range.
Yeah.
We're both in the zone. I'm in charge range.
So I can actually pinpoint the exact moment where I switched sides on pre-measuring. It was at a Warmachine weekend qualifier at Game Empire, and I lost the pair down in the semifinals because I screwed up my measurements on where Sorsha was going to be safe. I just guessed wrong, and I died, and I lost in the pair down, and that was the qualifier. The very next day, this was the Game Empire qualifier, which they were prohibited from having be Mark III, despite that Mark III released in 2 days.
Right, because you lost your qualifier spot. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was we had a qualifier spot in Texas, so we lost it because we played Mark III because nobody wanted to play Mark II.
Carl, wait. What? Guess who got that qualifier spot?
Right.
It was me.
Oh, was it? Nice.
I mean, 4 other people qualified after me, but it was funny.
Right.
So the very next day, because a bunch of people drove in from Phoenix and a bunch of people drove in from NorCal, and we're all there in LA, they have another follow-on tournament that's actually just a Mark III steamroller. Screw it, let's play some more games and see how this goes. We all rebuild lists. And I play my very first. My opponent are able to accurately resolve what will happen if Carver kills his own, totally ruined Warhog, and this frenzy goes off in such and such a manner. That was so nice and so amicable, and I lost that game, and yes, I totally think that was the right thing to do. The clarity and cleanness of the game and the availability of both players to the essential information to make yeah, I mean, the increased clarity to players and the ability to make meaningful decisions with all the information and without this uncertainty of will I be in, will I not? It was just a giant relief.
Mm-hmm. It's this pressure is lifted, and so much of the confrontationalism of the game of me versus you, and every time my opponent picks up his tape measure, lean forward and watch what he's doing. That doesn't happen anymore. It's so relaxing to play Warmachine with pre-measuring. Because you just know what's going to happen. It's I know, there's so many times where, we spend minutes, I'm not kidding, minutes, moving one model a 1/16 of an inch. And then look at the table for 5 more minutes. Because you're this is the game. If Butcher's in charge range of that, which charges further than my control, I lose the game. And so you're measure control range and shimmy, 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 and then all right, I'm betting everything on that, and you just walk away. It's just so nice to not have to do that anymore.
When we came on board with pre-measuring, it like you said, it just makes the game so much less. I came on board with it after thinking about it for 5 minutes. And what really got to me, and it's kind of what you were talking about with the game with Ryan, is you could basically already pre-measure. You just had to jump through these weird loopholes to do it. So what I hate most about this rule is the other stuff. Yeah, I like playing pre-measuring game because it's less stressful and a lower barrier to entry and all those kinds of things. But it just brings back those stupid loopholes to jump through. I've played 3 games, I think, so far with the latest ruling to where you can have one proxy base, but you can measure any point on the table using any number of instruments. And it's the same game. It's just less precise, and it takes a little bit longer. So I just don't see the point.
So within reason, we did talk about a little bit of this, but we're touching on it a little bit more now as well. So the argument is that you're stopping these people that are pre-measuring their entire turns.
I take issue with that too, because I've never seen that. The most egregious thing I ever saw, I think, was our game in the team tournament. The judge did most of it, and it was a 45-minute turn, but I think we put down maybe at most 3 proxy bases at one time. Most of it was measuring points to points and just being in the tank. And being in the tank is not it's not a Mark III phenomenon. That's not going to stop just because you can't put bases on the table. Well, because usually those plays you're doing that, you're going to lose if it doesn't work anyway. Who cares? I've got 45 minutes left on the clock. If it takes 44, the outcome of the game is going to change.
We've talked about this, so we're just rehashing it at this point. But yeah, I think mostly we agree that the clock situation is it's like a theoretical fantasy. Like, that situation is not only not fixed by this rule, I can't imagine any restriction you could add to pre-measuring that would remove that, because we have videoed games on YouTube right now on our channel that have people sitting there for over 30 minutes just looking at a table, measuring their control area 48 times over the course of that time. And it's not going to stop that from happening. When you're fucked, you're fucked. You need to find an answer. You're going to look at it until you have it.
I guess the irrelevant point that we just brought up, playing the game they intended them to play about. I wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit, because that kind of gets into some deep philosophical shit about the ownership of the game, I think.
Well, can I cut you off and we'll sideboard that, because that's definitely something I want to bring up. I think there is one more thing in this third and key intention that I think is important, and I literally haven't seen anyone talk about this besides the difference between contested skills and uncontested skills. If you guys follow David Serlin at all,
I've read his book.
Yeah, the Street Fighter guy. He actually has a great podcast on this, on the difference between contested skills and uncontested skills, and why you should design your game to minimize the importance of uncontested skill. Because you're playing this weird micro game where you have to in effect, doing the weaponized trigonometry is basically baking a cake. If you introduce the side skill of baking a cake as having an impact on the game of Warmachine, you're not finding out who the best Warmachine player is. You're finding out who the best cake baker is.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the uncontested measuring your positioning and taking measurements and moving your figures is a strictly uncontested skill. Your opponent cannot have any input until your movement is complete.
Yeah.
Introducing uncertainty to an uncontested skill only takes away from the strategic decision making in the game. What you care about is the importance of player decision, what their tactical and strategic decisions are. Mm-hmm. If you introduce errors in their executing their intentions and making their strategic things happen, you're making the game worse, straight up, just worse.
Yeah, I don't know how much I agree with that. I mean, I agree with your statement, and I 100% agree with the intent of the statement and where it was coming from. Just the statement of that the weaponized trigonometry as we know it from Mark II was an uncontested skill. I don't know if I agree with that part, because a little bit of that was how well can my opponent basically mask the distances on it. Like, if I know that you're not in threat range, but I can make it look like you are, then I can affect your play a little bit. I do think there's a little bit there, but I agree with your statement.
Well, like, I mean, we talked about this in the use of table markers.
Yeah.
Like, your use of table markers is a strictly uncontested skill.
Yeah, in Mark III it is. Yeah, I agree in Mark III. In Mark II, I guess I was referring to. I didn't realize you were only talking about Mark III, and I 100% agree about if it's only about Mark III.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think the game gets worse if you introduce it's not even introducing uncertainty or risk in the same way Dice does. Like, Dice adds plenty of ambiguity to the game. At that point, you're talking about not even introducing real risk or uncertainty. You're just talking about introducing execution errors. You're talking about introducing how many times the players fuck up. And that's it.
Yeah.
I can't say how many times in Mark II my opponent declared his intention to me, and I just said, fuck it, we'll pre-measure it, and basically put the proxy down, put it like, we both know you're going to charge to max melee at this angle, and as soon as he tells me that's his intention, we just do it. I don't care what happens. I don't care if we're technically cheating, but like, I did that so much in Mark II, and then in Mark III, he can just do it himself. And like, if he declares like, well, and the worst was like Watcher and Dark Sentinel and Countercharge and shit like that. We both know, like, in some situations, there's a spot you can land to not fuck yourself and get the most bang for your buck. But there's no way for you to find it, and you're literally going to hit the lottery or not. And so either you're going to get two heavies to my heavy without triggering Dark Sentinel, or you're going to charge in the first one and lose the fucking game. Like, that's literally the game we played, and it's just... You sit there and watch your opponent lose the game until he's done it 40 times and finally figures out where that sweet spot is. And then he wins. And it's like, that's not good for either person. We're both just basically knowing what we want to do, not being able to translate that to the board because you can't judge 5.001 inches at a distance of 2 feet with your naked eye. Well, congratulations.
You could also turn that around and say the player with the defensive ability couldn't judge that 5.001 inches and allow.
Well, there's
that
sometimes
spot to
where you
exist.
just have to leave them out. Like, you can't realistically, you can't leave every beast in Dark Sentinel forever, right? At some point, you have to spread out a little bit, or something has to happen.
You couldn't leave every beast in Dark Sentinel range.
Well, I mean, I think that goes back to the uncontested skill thing, and that you are creating an uncontested skill that's entirely exogenous to the game of Warmachine, which is to say your strategic and tactical placements. And instead,
I think we're
using the exogenous, like, uncontested skill of eyeballing distances.
We're not talking about... Let's be fair. They're not talking about getting rid of pre-measuring.
No, they're not. And I'm not saying that, but we're just talking about, within reason, restricting what you can do is only adding to... basically the times in a game when you're going to win because your opponent wasn't able to properly translate what they wanted to do.
Well,
right?
But so according to their latest ruling, I can't think of a scenario that exists that you could pre-measure before and you can't pre-measure now. It's just a lot more awkward.
I mean, it is a lot more awkward, but there are some you can't. Like, you can't legally measure impact attacks anymore. Or measuring a hypothetical walk TK, where does your TK model end up? I want to charge to that location. You cannot measure that. That is not possible at all anymore.
That is something you will if you have, like, Haley 2...
No, hold on.
You can't pre-measure the walk... measure range from your model to the model you're going to TK, then pre-measure the TK and the charge movement. Like, so Kaylee walks forward.
It even stops at the TK placement. You
can't measure where the model will end up. And at least
because you can physically move the proxy base as if you were moving the model. You don't have to leave the TK. It doesn't require multiple proxy bases to do that.
No, you can't pre-measure the entire event. You can pre-measure your walk and then choose to walk there, and then put down the proxy base, only after you've committed to the move to see where that model could end up, and if you could get a charge distance to that model.
I must not be understanding what you're talking about.
I want to pre-measure Haley walking her max distance forward, or at least to get spell range on another model. So I put a proxy down for where she's going to end her movement. I then want to measure the distance to the model knowing it's in spell range. I then want to know if I were to TK that model I'm in spell range of, if it would be within charge range of my other model. And because you can't measure the volume of its base, it's possible to make a mistake on a non-perfect line charge.
Exactly.
This is what I'm talking about, though. You can do that because you don't have to put the proxy base down for Haley. You can simply use a 6-inch measuring tool and then another 8-inch measuring tool for the range of TK, and then use your proxy base.
That is only true if you're not going to max spell range or you're moving in a direct line towards the model.
Exactly.
Because you're not measuring from the furthest most point of the base, you're measuring from the closest point to closest point for spell range.
Right. So, but this is part of the problem I have with it, because you can technically do well. So they claim you can. You're right. It can introduce errors.
Right.
But so what happens when that error happens? You could also get a measuring tool that's not square on the end. It's rounded like a base, which is what I assume we'll all do.
Right. So, but that's the problem is now you're literally buying an advantage in the game. And we talked about that, and all we can assume is that either these things will be banned or we'll just basically ignore the rule anyway. So why are we making a rule that you have to spend money to ignore? So that's completely irrelevant.
This is my big problem with the rules. I'm not sure what it accomplishes or what it's trying to accomplish, because I think you can do all those things anyway. I think you could do it with one proxy mason measuring from any point to any point on the table, or you could at least do it enough to where you and your opponent can come to an agreement on what happens. So I don't know what the point of the rule is.
Right.
Well, I mean, at that point, it's just introducing obscurantism, which is entirely unnecessary.
Exactly.
So this is where intention number 3 really matters, as it's voiced in the CID thread, is, well, we meant you could pre-measure, but we didn't we meant you could pre-measure anything, but we didn't really mean you could pre-measure anything.
We didn't really mean anything.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's like, well, then what's the point? Like, if you can't foresee coming, like, I don't know how to help you. I mean, because that kind of pre-measurement is when you have a dispute, when a judge needs to be called and you need to execute the game legally. According to the written rules, the judge follows this exact procedure, and you prohibit the players from following that exact procedure. That seems insane to me. That seems like utter madness.
Because ultimately that is what you'll do in that situation of, well, I need to know exactly where. You'll call a judge and just have them do it. So what are we going to is it just going to boil down to us telling the judge our intention and then them moving the models for us?
I do want to say something here because we touched on this earlier, and I'm going to explain it to you because you weren't here. We came up with something that the new rules actually completely remove, which is there are instances of people that are basically tripping over their own proxy. So they pre-measure so many things that they forget what's a model and what's not a model based on proxy bases, and like what's not a flag, what's an objective. They get so bogged down with all the stuff that they've done that they start making mistakes, like moving through models that are actually supposed to be there. And we've come up with ways you can counter that, but that doesn't mean you can't come up with that situation. And Ritchie brought that up, and it's a good point because that is something that is not prevented at this point, and it creates a whole new judge issue that hasn't been brought up before, really, or at least at anywhere near this amount of times. And so Ritchie's argument was we can remove that entire judge call and remove all the hassle the judge and the time-consuming events that come up during a tournament by removing this. Well, if this goes through like anywhere close to as is, like in theory it might, which hopefully it gets cleaned up at least to the point where everyone's happy with it. But if this happens, I'm basically just going to call the judge anytime there's not anything I can't conveniently pre-measure. Any other time, either I or my opponent is getting screwed, and I don't want that to happen. I don't want to screw myself. I'm tired of screwing myself to make sure I don't screw my opponent, and I don't want to screw my opponent. So I'm just going to call the judge, and I'm going to sit there and watch him measure stuff until we're 100% sure. And the judge tells me this is 100% legal, your opponent can't tell you can't do it, and then I'm going to do it. Which just means we need a judge per table. And that's literally ridiculous.
Right, and that's my issue with Ritchie's argument, which is that, you cut off a new realm of judge problems which is opened up, but you've reopened all the previous judge calls that had existed beforehand. And you are making it illegal for players to measure as the judge would to properly resolve the situation, which they were doing already.
Is the judge going to be able to measure them without the player committing to the movement?
The judge isn't a player, so he doesn't have to follow the rules.
So if I do this complicated maneuver, does it work? And if I call a judge over to ask him if it works, is he going to say, well, if I measure this, you've committed? And if it's there, it's there?
I don't think he would. I guess that's a good point. Right.
What's the point then?
What's the point of the rule?
No, he's asking if... Because like in Mark II, you would have to commit to something because you couldn't pre-measure it. Well, we're literally in a situation where you can't pre-measure something. Do you have to commit to it for the judge to tell you if it's legal or not?
Yes, you did previously, and I think you would again.
I think you would too. So basically, we're just going back to a non-pre-measuring. It's so...
Okay, so we've definitely covered that certain people are frustrated, and definitely everyone's frustrated, but just about maybe slightly different things. And I do think Ritchie brought up a good point, and that is something we can fix, and this is maybe an exact example of what CID is doing right, is it's getting us to talk about this in extreme depth and analyze it from every aspect. And maybe we could come up with some kind of between telling people they have to keep their models where they are unless they physically don't fit there, and removing pre-measuring from some extent. Like, maybe we can find some happy middle ground in which everyone is like, this is just straight better.
But so it's the idea behind intention number 3 that's the problem. The entire intention is the problem. It's not even the effect.
Sounds like... Sorry, go ahead.
What the intention requires to happen, like negates a lot of the quality of the game.
You can't... that intention cannot exist in a pre-measure game. It just can't.
No.
I do think
I agree, and that's why I think it's absurd that they've pushed this intention like really far down our throats. Like, we didn't intend for you to measure everything. Like, well, that's not what the rule says.
That's not what you said.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we've been talking for a really long time. Richie and Scott, is there anything you guys agree, disagree with what we said, want to bring up, want to talk about?
So part of their intention, like we've alluded to this, part of their intent that we did not foresee this happening. It's not part of our intention. So a lot of what we're saying is we're tossing out words like clean play, but I think clean play is getting misused, because instead of clean play, because clean play to me is, I'm going to move my model here. This is the measurement. Do you agree that I can move my model here?
Mm-hmm.
That's clean play to me. What we were talking, well, there are some extreme scenarios. Well, if I'm going to proxy Haley moving 6 inches this way to this direction, so Thorn is now in my control range. So now I'm going to do here. Assuming that my TK hits, I'm going to move this 6 inches here and turn him around, and then you go through like minutions of 4 or 5 different activations. That's not clean play. That's perfect information.
Yeah, it's maximum efficiency, and I agree that is right. A different thing than clean play.
That is perfect information, and that's what they don't want.
Right. I can see that as an argument. That's an interesting point. I guess. And this is an opinion of mine, and maybe we should definitely talk about this more. I think that I am more than happy to let my opponent have perfect measurement understanding of the game, especially in what we call a pre-measured game, so that my opponent isn't moving a 1/16 of an inch, checking control, moving 1/16 of an inch, checking control. And we both know that, again, this spot exists. We're supposed to be able to measure distances and everything. We're supposed to have perfect knowledge of measurements. Why can't we just agree that he goes to this spot that we both know exists?
I do kind of want to touch on, just as I want to, so I apologize if that's so, but I think we're talking about clean play, especially when it comes to this, the way they phrase this rule, because this rule makes the way you used proxy bases in Mark II, which was not a pre-measured game, to play the game cleanly illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Mark II, we used multiple proxy bases to play the movement on a single a single line of a single model for free strikes, for charge lanes, for rough terrain. And so this does affect clean play, because if you can't put down multiple proxy bases during one model's activation, you don't necessarily – there are probably a number of situations that can arise in the game that you can't perfectly measure to see what that model did get to where it was supposed to go or not.
It made
a legal move.
Yeah, we did talk about that. And like that's why I brought up impact attacks. Is they are a mechanic that, as described in the rulebook under this rule, it is illegal to measure correctly.
Sure, but so I think that's why we talk about clean play. Now we probably are misusing the term and kind of lumping everything into clean play, where we should be distinguishing between clean play and perfect information. So that's a good point.
And another thing,
there's a reason to talk about clean play.
Another thing I want to bring up real quick before we move on, because we're still fresh on it. Richie, you talked about how, like, the example we gave of Haley walking forward and then TKing and then her jack charging it and stuff like that, and that like string of events. You said that we lumped that in with clean play, which is true. We're basically doing perfect information instead. But my problem mainly with this situation is you are 100% allowed to measure everything we talked about and put proxy bases down for everything. But because you have to pick up the proxy bases as you move through the cycle of events, it opens up room for micron-like sized errors to basically ruin your entire chain of events. You're allowed to measure all this out and make sure you can do all of it, but now there's a chance you're gonna bump a proxy base and ruin your turn, and that's what we're gaining. That's the benefit of this change.
Right. So I'm going to go out on a limb and define clean play here.
Okay.
You know what I talked about with
Good luck.
impact attacks. No, what I talked about with impact attacks is measurement. Like, that is legal or illegal game state, and being able to measure whether this game state is legal or illegal. Like, you can't do that. But the Haley TK thing, that's implementing a plan that is perfect knowledge. What clean play is stating your intention, making a measurement, and getting your opponent's acquiescence, agreement, consensus to. This is, we are agreed between the two of us, this measurement is both accurate and acceptable. That's clean play.
I would also like to add to that, you basically are effectively declaring your intention to your opponent, and your opponent is confirming that what you intend to do is both legal and possible, and then you are both agreeing that that is the state of the game. And
exactly.
That is my goal when I pre-measure things, not to...
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
Okay, right. And when I talked about what clean play defined to me earlier was, I said basically the same thing. Clean play to me is I have my model here and I move here and we agree, move on. But back to the point where, now it's like microns of error and things can go wrong, etc. They want some sort of fog of war. They want risk to happen. They want yada yada yada. Now, as much as you may hate that, I may hate that, members on the Skype or whatever may hate that, they want some level of uncertainty in their game.
Then it can't be a pre-measure game. I don't think there's a state that exists that you can adjudicate between pre-measure and non-pre-measure. I think you have to go back to a Mark II, where there are only a very limited number of definable instances where you can pre-measure.
Agreed. And I mean, I think, you can want that and you can have that, but I think it's a foolish thing to do. And we've talked about the difference between Mark II and Mark III. I vastly prefer the rule state for measurement as it exists in Mark III to Mark II. And if I had to go back to the way Mark II was, I probably wouldn't continue to play the game long term.
Certainly not in a competitive format.
Yeah, absolutely not. I would stop. It's not worth it after I've had it this new way, and I see that this one way is better than the other, and the company that's in charge of designing the game wants to go back to the way that I prefer less.
But gotta say, before we say better, the way you prefer is the way that you prefer as the upper 5% of players, like going to the WTC, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the upper 5%. You prefer it this way.
Bro, we're Team Scrub.
I think it's fair.
You're still there. You're still there. So
I do think it's fair that to call it the more competitive way to play the game.
Yeah, and as far as the realm of better versus worse goes, I'll fully admit I am 100% speaking in the realm of value judgment. And if the value judgments of the staffers contradict what I'm saying, that's their prerogative. I'm going to stop playing the game if that's the case. And I know a lot of players who are also going to stop playing the game. Like, that's everyone's prerogative. There's nothing wrong or right with it.
Yeah, I hate to say that I would consider quitting Warmachine because of the pre-measure thing. And realistically, as is the current rules for pre-measuring, I think most of us would probably just muscle through it. But exactly like the Haley example is frustrating, is because you can't tell me that the intention was that I can perfectly measure a straight charge lane to you and no one can argue about it, or a single model charging to a single place. But because we can't pre-measure more than one thing at a time, or one table marker at a time, basically a proxy base or some kind of AoE effect, we can get into this situation where if anything gets bumped during, and we're only talking like 3 models interacting with each other, my caster's going to move, affect your model, and then I'm going to charge it. And if any one of those models gets slightly bumped at any point during the movement of these 3 models, the entire thing falls apart. Then we're just back to Mark II, where I have to intentionally screw myself to ensure my measurements are fair, or screw my opponent because they're not. Like, I don't want that to happen. And there's got to be a way that we don't concede that level of clean play because of these random, ambiguous things that we might or might not be even fixing.
The effect on new players. Like, my store has seen new players coming in, and with pre-measuring in place, the learning curve for them is dramatically reduced. I've seen these players like become skilled players, or at least like become skilled mid-tier players far faster than any time in the game. And just introducing issues with that, like even playing with these new players, they found the rule incredibly frustrating.
The barrier to entry of this game is incredibly high, and I think this will make it higher.
We've talked about what does this stop, basically. Like, so who are the people that this is stopping, that act like a rule like this or some variation of it is actually going to stop? Who is it going to stop from like doing stuff wrong? So we've got the people that are going to pre-measure their entire turns. We've got the, I guess, total douchebags that play by steamroller rules and don't use a clock and then pre-measure everything forever, and like make their opponent sit there for 6 hours. Again, I don't know why you would play that person ever again. So basically the question is, who is abusing pre-measure to the point where we need to do something about it? And I'm not saying that sarcastically. I'm like, seriously, or maybe just, and to be fair, maybe our collective impression is just that that's not a problem, and everyone from the outside looking is like, that's a problem. That's too much. Like, and that's open talk. Who are these people?
I can only answer this anecdotally. I have no broad source of data that allows me to speak holistically to the severity of this. What I can say is that I have been when we went to Des Moines, one of the biggest recommendations from several very competitive players, and I can name names if you want to, but it's honestly immaterial. One of the biggest recommendations was, quote, abuse proxies, unquote. It was in a game that I had to back up because I had screwed up my second turn so badly. Now, with that being said, there were a lot of existential factors, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why and why not and all that other crap. But I can say from my own personal experience, I have been told from several different players, as that X and 1 tryhard, right? I have been told by several different players, you need to abuse proxies. Use more proxies. Get them all out there. Put them all on the table. There is a level at which the overuse without committing is encouraged. And you can see this on social media. One of the things that comes up a lot is like, how do I deal with a gun line? Well, it's easy. you mark off their gun ranges, you put proxies down to where you can figure out like the best way you get everybody behind cover, and then you advance, and then so on and so forth. Now, whether that's good or bad is completely immaterial, and I'm not defending that position. What I am stating, though, is that that mindset has been propagated, if nothing else, than across the smaller, portion of the population.
So something I want to touch on that you just said, that is correct, that might be a level like the perfect knowledge of where I'm going to put my guys. But like, we are playing a pre-measure game. Like, unless we're going to completely delete pre-measure, that can't go away. I get to measure from my model to your model. I get to know if I'm in gun range or not while I'm advancing. So that is one thing that literally you can't do without removing pre-measure entirely. But there were some other things you tapped on, like they say abuse proxy bases. They might also have been speaking in exaggeration to you, because I never see you put proxies down except when you're moving a model and then you get rid of it. Like you already follow these rules, so it's not like a big deal to you, right?
Right. I try to keep my board as clean as possible whenever possible. Right. So, but hold on though. Like there's a flip side to that, because the context behind that conversation was not like, oh, well, you need to you should totally put down a proxy base for Rask, or you should put down a proxy base for that Wrestler, and then see where you're going to go. The context behind that conversation is that you should not, from what I took away from it, and this was not one person telling me this was multiples, is that I should not have been moving models until I knew exactly where Wrong Iron Snapjaw and Warsh and Brian were going to be collectively in relationship to Rask and my double Wrestlers. And so the solution to that was literally to place a minimum of four large base proxies and then 3 small base proxies. So that's 7 right there. Now, I understand their intent, and their advice was very, very good, and it's helped me a lot with trolls. I'm not saying it was bad, and I'm not arguing the validity of the advice given, because it was very, very good.
Basically, in this situation, pre-measuring has been a tool to help you learn spatial awareness.
No, I think that's a very valid statement, but
if pre-measuring, in this situation, is basically, and if you keep using it as a crutch, then maybe it's an issue, but I see that as a benefit, because you're able to learn what it looks like to move your models into the correct positions in advance to be able to execute these maneuvers without using the proxy bases. And if you're using them as a crutch, then it might be an issue, long term.
That is exactly my point, is that after that player who learns this, after that player who gets this revelation of using these tools, they then continue to do it and continue to do it and continue to do it. And then it does become the situation that we've talked about, right? So
can't you punish that player with clock?
Sure, and we've talked about that too. It's his time. If he wants to send forever pre-measuring, he can.
I'm sure you have, but specifically in this situation, if you're playing against that guy, can't you just punish him by playing to the clock? I mean, that's something that has counterplay.
Well, and also it reduces the impact of a memorization intensive skill. Because imagine you don't have that crutch, and you just get hit over and over and over again, and, well, I guess there's nothing I can do about it, and I guess this sucks.
Right. Also, if you can't learn, if that some spatial awareness is a serious problem for you, just like eyeballing distances might be, I know players in my meta that, just cannot position models, and it's, to the point where they basically quit the game. They can measure all the distances they want all day and just don't understand where their models need to be in advance. So pre-measuring, in a way, might help them learn these skills that are required for the game. And so by removing them, we're basically creating an insurmountable plateau or bump in your learning curve that is basically going to lead to you either quitting the game or never succeeding. And that's probably an extreme, to be fair.
Yeah, that's the extra hyperbole.
But how many games would you have had to play? And I don't know, or maybe you're still crutching on this, but how many games would you have to play before you just learned where you needed to be? How many games in a row do you have to go, man, that guy's just out of star-crossed? Or how many times do you have to hit that before you just naturally learn with muscle memory to leave him back or to move your guy farther forward? And this is just one example of positioning that this might dramatically help people.
Right. It can be a tool. I'm not saying it's not. What I am saying is that there is a point at which it ceases to be a tool, right? And then that creates that board full of proxies that they've talked about not wanting to be there. That's the only point I'm trying to make. As far as my positioning as an individual player, my positioning actually is typically fairly decent.
Well, I think there's something there, though, which is I think the causality and the chain of what actually happens for a player is the opposite. Like, I think the trend you get from that is an intuitively better ability to reason spatially, and just knowing that stuff cold, or knowing the kind of measurements that are relevant goes up, and the number of measurements they need to take goes down.
I agree.
So you're saying you're saying that a practice that would lead to 100% safety, that people will naturally deviate from as their skill increases, or even as high skill players, they will still take the time to do it with 100% safety?
I think they'll take the time to do it with 100% safety, but
so those proxies will always be out.
I mean, the time it'll take them to do it will go down significantly, and the difference is measurement is not the same as a tactical decision. The two are different categories. Measurement is not a tactical decision in and of itself. It's what you do with the measurement. And players who have made the measurements and understand the tactical decisions, begirding those, will not be as prone to error and will arrive at a satisfactory situation faster.
Right, but at the end of the day, does Scott still place the 7 proxy bases necessary to complete that move? Yes or no? The answer is probably yes.
I mean, yeah, I think at that point that's like a contested skill. But yeah, I mean, the axis on which it's contested is his opponent presenting him with new permutations. They take their turn and they move in ways he hasn't seen, and he has to proxy base to figure out what reacts to this in a manner that satisfies him.
Kind of to your point, I think as a player gets more experience in positioning, they know at least this is my experience, they can identify the movements that require the precision of a proxy base and the movements that don't, and they know that time's a resource. So I don't necessarily think that an experienced player and an inexperienced player are going to put the same amount of proxy bases out.
Absolutely agreed. And also, yeah, even if Scott is still placing the 7 bases on his turn, the only person who incurs damage from that is Scott in terms of the time it takes. He is the only one to internalize the cost of that, of his actions. And I think that's exactly
unless you're placing markers down on your opponent's turn,
which isn't legal.
That's illegal. So that's cheating.
It is legal. They just switch the time over.
Right, but which means you can't do it on his time. Placing markers on your opponent's time is against the rules because you're taking actions during your opponent's death clock. It needs to be on your death clock for you to take actions.
And that was clarified in an errata 6-ish months ago.
I think Alex is saying, as far as it goes to Scott placing the 7 proxies required to complete the task he's trying to complete, it gets to a point at which he no longer needs to do that, with the exception of that his opponent is gaining equal skill in positioning and utility, like basically learning different tools to use and different maneuvers to take to accomplish certain goals, and that they will keep placing the same number of bases in like an arms race kind of thing. Like one player steps it up by making a more advanced or more technical or more precise maneuver, and they play off of each other going back and forth, as where if he gets to a point like his opponent in theory is in this stasis that never changes, he will quickly adapt to it and understand the situation to the point where the proxies are not required. But because his opponent is also advancing at what we would assume to be a similar rate in a perfect world, that they will keep requiring them because they're both getting better and better all the time. And then when it goes to Karl, I agree with him completely because your opponent is taking all this time to pre-measure. And again, if basically Scott becomes the person in stasis, he's always using his proxy bases because he's not against the same person because he's not getting better enough to not need them effectively, is that you're just going to get to the point where you can't win games within the time allotment because you're doing all these extra actions that aren't actually required because you're not learning how to play your army. So you're just playing yourself into a hole by doing these things. You're actually penalizing yourself more than... And people either don't know that or aren't feeling the effects of it because they're either losing but for other reasons than clock, or they're actually still winning their games, which means they're playing people either below their skill level or they're having very good matchups.
And as you get more experienced, in that place, I just want to kind of talk more about the counterplay there, because as you get more experience, I've found that if I don't pre-measure where I'm putting my models because I know where they need to go, and I force my opponent to take his clock to pre-measure to make sure I did it right, which I'm gambling that I can do more often than not, significantly more often than not, enough games to win a tournament, then he's using his clock to pre-measure for me. I don't think it's fair to say at all that an inexperienced player and an experienced player will use the same number of proxy bases, because there's a lot that goes into those decisions, I think. Because pre-measuring and proxy bases gives you information and your opponent equal information. So if you can get to a point in the game where you can play knowing that, keeping the information to yourself, disguising that information and forcing your opponent to discover it using their resources, I think that's valid. So,
I mean, I agree as well, but I mean, like, I don't think that's a kind of special skill that you want to punish. It's just, a kind of special familiar, like,
sure, no, I don't think
expertise.
it is.
Like, and I really want to be playing a game where every time I sit down from a player, we are playing that higher and higher level game. Like the skill of our execution and the speed of our execution and the accuracy of our execution keeps escalating, and the strategic and tactical decisions we're called upon to make go higher and higher and keep next leveling. That's the kind of game I want to play. But if you take away the pre-measuring, the kind of game you get is an increased number of gotchas. The distance between those steps and the escalation of the quality and maturity of our game gets wider and wider and wider.
I 100% agree. You just get more gotchas and bumps and errors, and it just things that we're not, that in theory, like, I think everyone when they think of pre-measuring thinks that these problems, like who's failed a charge unintentionally in Mark III? Because you might now. Do you want that to be part of the game? Like,
I actually did so on Thursday.
You did? You failed a charge?
It didn't matter. I just wanted a model out of the way, so I was like, yeah, charge. Oh, I'm out.
Yeah, but sure. I mean, you elected not to measure and guess. Yeah, it's funny. So, but like moving on to the point, it's like, I pre-measured this, I got it, and you planned your entire turn around that. But because you couldn't put the model out there and confirm it with your opponent in advance, now I go to activate my model, but I rolled my dice early in the turn and bumped your guy. Guess I'm fucked now. Like, that's going to happen to me once, and I'm going to call the judge, and I'm going to argue.
You can still pre-measure and get agreement from your opponent.
You can still pre-measure and charge, like even under the current.
No, it's not that I'm not activating him now. It's like I pre-measure my control phase. Sweet, he's in charge range. I allocate him focus. I gotta move some models out of his way. And at some point, he gets bumped. I'm like, well, there's no proxy base there saying I measured it. I did measure it, but this doesn't work anymore.
So you pre-measure it and you declare, hey, this model's in charge range. Do you agree? Like that's still fine. That hasn't changed. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean by I don't think it has. And that's what I mean by saying pre-measuring is not going away. It's just getting weirder. That's the kind of the best way I can.
It's getting awkward.
I do agree with that. It does need to be cleaned. I do agree that it is awkward.
That's my biggest problem with if they want to go back to a non-pre-measure game, just go back to a non-pre-measure game.
That's what I said on Thursday, and you're like, I would quit the game instantly if that happened.
Oh, sure, I would. But don't pussyfoot around about it.
No, I 100% agree. If you want to play Mark II, and this is the thing, like, who complained in Mark II about, this guy checked his control range 28 times on his turn? Like he can do that. Like, why is that wrong? Like, we all agree that he can do that. And so some people in the back, you should be able to check control ranges. Like, I would have been the first person to vote for that because I would have screwed so many people out of games. Like, if we're going on, sure, like, I get an advantage if people don't do this. And, like, I don't see the argument of, like, people, like, I don't know. I'm just rehashing the same points because I'm upset. It's fine. I'm going to shut up now. Yeah. So we're going to move on to the next topic, because I think we've covered this, is who does it hurt? Who is penalized most by these changes if they were to go through in some similar fashion to how they are?
Current tournament players.
By current tournament players, you mean everyone that plays SteamRoller?
Yes. I think, well, sure. I would say players who have become competitive without playing Mark II.
Yeah, that's the other one I was going to mention, is new players who want to be competitive are severely hurt by this. And, like, holy shit. The new players I've seen over the last 6 to 8 months have grown so much faster than I have ever seen any player grow before. Every single one of them. It's mind-boggling.
I learn what 6 inches looks like.
I completely agree. Because there's not that stupid 2-year barrier to entry to learn how to have a carpenter's eye. Like, you just play. Like, it's just my decisions versus your decisions. All the ambiguity bullshit is gone.
Yeah, and if you're the company designing this game, and your goal is to get a lifelong customer or to maximize the length of churn before a customer exits the system, yeah, absolutely. Don't put any barriers in their way. Have them escalate as fast as possible into the zone where they're buying product routinely. Like, holy shit.
Okay.
Like, from a business perspective, this change is madness.
Yeah. So this change obviously only affects people that go to tournaments, effectively, in my opinion, because the SteamRoller package...
No, because we talked about it.
I'm getting to that. I'm not done. Yeah.
Yeah, a competitive format trickles down into the rest of the way the game is played. If you have any competitive players, this affects the face of the game for everyone.
And yeah, so like I was going to say is, you are penalizing, I think, the people on the lower end of the curve, because the people on the highest end of, like, arguably the skill curve, like, regardless of who they are people that are going to naturally find ways around stuff and adapt quickly. Like, that's already who they are, I think. As where the people on the lower end of the curve, they're, like, struggling to get to, like, the next tier, like the intermediates or the casuals trying to get to intermediate, are going to suffer the most, because they're going to be the people that don't have, like, for example, the most up-to-date token set that lets them, like, break whatever rules or bend the rules as close as they can without breaking kind of stuff. Those are the people that are going to not know what they can pre-measure at sometimes and not know. I never like referring to people on skill level. It really bothers me. But if you have to break it down to the smallest aspect of my point, it's the less skilled players are going to be the ones making the mistakes that this system would cause. They're going to be the ones paying the price and feeling the growing pains of, like, not being able to put down 2 proxies at once over someone that's been, like, basically doing it at a more advanced level. It's like they've practiced weaponized trigonometry more. Not that they've been playing longer. It's just that they understand it better, which is why they're better. Like, the people better than me are better than me because they know everything and they understand the positioning and the spatial awareness better than I do.
It's not even skill in terms of, like, a relevant skill to a tactical game. It's skill in terms of, I know what 6 1/4 inches looks like.
It's baking a cake.
It's Alex's point. It's not. It really doesn't have anything to do with skill at Warmachine. So I don't know that it really will affect. I don't know if it's fair to say it'll affect lower skill players.
Yeah, I think it's actually going to affect the higher echelon more, because they're the ones. Because typically, what they're going to seek to limit are the I'm getting so much echo now. So they're seeking to limit the highly intricate plans, such as, like, well, I need to have warp my shifting stones here. I need to have this model kill and warpath trigger into the shifting stones but I need to make sure I have exactly enough room so when I port the target over here, I can kill your caster or your heavy or whatever.
They won't go through with that plan.
Yeah,
you won't see the high skill plays.
It's because
is that high skill or is a high skill or is, like, I have absolute perfect information.
Well, no, I think seeing that play on the table is a skill. I think that is absolutely a high skill play.
Yeah,
I don't know how else you define it.
You'll see the more skilled players pulling the abort switch more frequently against games in games with other extremely high skill players. Like where their execution in sort of applied trigonometry is a lot higher, you'll see more players pulling the abort switch earlier, but the area where you will see the greatest change is not in relatively equal skill versus equal skill, but where there is a skill disparity in terms of being able to do trigonometry. That's where you'll see the greatest impact, which is to say tournament players versus new players. You're creating exclusion, you're increasing the difficulty of the learning curve, you're increasing the importance of this uncontested cake baking skill.
I have a question, and I don't know if maybe it's on your list. Their stated intention is to introduce more risk into the game. Is there a way to do that doesn't touch pre-measuring?
Raise defenses.
Yeah, put defensive back.
Yep. Or just return power attacks the way they used to be. That was a hell of a lot riskier to play the game. Everything they do is to remove. I just mean that the fact that you might die on top of one. I throw my Avenger, higher clever feat, you're dead. That was fun. I don't know. It's just what do you mean by risk in the game? Do you want to feel like you've come up with this great plan, and now something you have no control over screwed it up? Why would you want that?
First of all, Brandon, it's not what I mean. It's what they mean. I think what they mean by more risk in the game is coming up with a plan, and it being riskier.
So I did talk about this. Coming up with a plan is totally different from uncertainty in the measurement. And what they're talking about doing
right. Oh, I understand.
Risk is uncertainty in measurement.
So I understand that, and that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid execution errors or introducing forced execution errors. So is there another way to increase uncertainty in plans that don't force those execution errors?
Make you roll dice for your movement distance.
Yeah, in a tabletop game, no. Not unless you have random movement distance or charges or something.
Literally, when you said that, all I could picture is is there a way to drive more nails into my forehead? That's all I could hear. Ugh.
There's something in that I'd like to touch on, which is the fundamental incentives of being in the design studio versus not being in the design studio and why you play Warmachine. I don't think the designers, because they're barred from entering competition without explicit exception, and because they generally playtest within their own playtest guidelines, they're generally not playing on clock. They're generally not playing under condition. They're not routinely playing under conditions of actual competition. I mean, I think the signals they receive for success are totally different from the signals players receive for success, and I think that introduces a weird new substrata of issues.
I will say that I talked to Will at ATC because he was playing, and they're
Which
no longer
Will? There's three.
Pagani. Sorry,
Pagani.
there's 1,000. So I talked to Pagani at ATC because he's playing and he's a staffer now. So no one in the company is excluded from playing in the event. In any event, they simply must decline any prize support they win from the event. So, and that's a recent change from what he told me. So that maybe we'll see more staffers at events.
I'm going to call that the Pagani rule.
Well, it's probably the Pagani rule, so he'll work for the company. But anyway, moving on. So we've already destroyed the next topic, which is barrier to entry. I think me and Alex definitely agreed that it increases barrier to entry noticeably. I think Karl did too. Anytime you restrict what someone's allowed to do and ask them to perform the same task without doing the things they were doing before, it's increasing the barrier. And it's going to make people that like pre-measuring, even if they're not abusing it, but just don't like having the restriction, are going to naturally shy away from tournaments even more than they already do. And I think we don't need any more people not wanting to play with the quote unquote competitive people. All I want to do, I'm a community organizer. It's what I do, and all I want is people to play games together. Why is this difficult? Like, it drives me insane that, like I go talk, I was like, oh, no, I'm not very good at the game. I can't go to a tournament. I'm like, if you just came to one event, you would see that everyone here is more hopeless than you are. Like they have no idea what they're doing half the time. Like, just come and play and hang out with us. We want to see you. Like, and they don't. They just stay home. And it's like, it frustrates the shit out of me. House ruling. I've already heard so many people, and they do this every time a rule is about to change, but they say, well, I'm not going to play by that rule. I'm going to play by my own rule. But I think in this situation, it's even more so because it's not even what are the players going to do, it's what is the judge going to do. If I'm at an event and I'm trying to measure me charging through difficult terrain, and I put 2 proxies down at once, because it's the only actual fucking way ever to actually measure this properly without screwing me or my opponent, and my opponent calls a judge on me for it, what's gonna happen? The guy's gonna come over and say, you're fucking retarded, shut up, he's doing nothing wrong. Or he's gonna come over and say, that's an official warning or a game loss. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, that's literally the 2 things that might happen.
It has to be an official warning or game loss.
It has to be, or he's not following. Well, no, because the judge can do whatever he wants. That's fact.
But if they're playing by that rule, then
sure. If they're following every rule in the steamroller to the letter, they have to give you a game warning for that, which is ridiculous. Yeah. Like, if someone gave me a game warning for that, I would literally drop from the event, and like, I don't want to play with you. Like I'm doing this for your benefit. Like, and you're gonna call a judge on me, I'm gonna give you a game warning. Like, that drives me insane. And specifically because it's at what level does this happen? And this is even more so when I bring in the different merchandise. Like when the guy comes in with the maneuver sticks that have rounded ends that are the size of proxy bases. Is the judge going to let him play in Omaha? Is the judge going to let him play in Texas? Is the judge going to let him play at Adepticon? Like, when are these okay? Like, now you have to buy all these stupid minutia things just because some judge might let it work. And if you actually want to try and be competitive, you need every advantage you can. If your opponents are using these and you're not allowed to, you have an unfair disadvantage. It's like, this is probably the most ambiguous rule we've ever had. And obviously, we're gonna play test it. We're gonna get it through CID. So we're gonna do everything we can to make it fair. But
I like Jeremy's solution. Just make Warmachine a hex game.
I mean, I have less of an argument against that. I am defeated. But then I'd have to play games with the idiots that play Mech Warrior, and that would kill me. They would be next to each other, it's like, hey, you play hexes now, and I'd just pull out a gun and shoot myself.
I mean Battletech?
That one. The one that the people play with the little robots. Fucking mouth
Mech
breathers.
Warrior is the clicky one.
It's even worse. That wasn't even a hex, it was a crid, right? God. Anyway. So, do people agree that, like, is house ruling a problem, or am I crazy? Like, is that going to happen?
No, I think that's going to happen. Yeah. I think that's going to be a problem. I think it's going to cause divergence in the tournament scene, which is, like, the absolute last thing that you want.
Which just, again, increases barrier to entry because, like...
By divergence, I mean divergence of the rules used for tournaments.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, I'll finally convince one of my locals to go to a tournament, and he'll come to the tournament, and they'll interpret the rules differently than he does, or they won't allow him to use his special move.
No, I think it'll be intentional divergence.
No, I know. No, I agree. But I don't even think if we got rid of all the intentional bullshit, like, oh yeah, we're following the steamroller document, no special pre-measuring stuff, what it says in the book, and we get there, and they're letting some dude use measure sticks with proxy bases on the end. And he's like, this is bullshit. It says you can't do that. And he's like, well, I don't think so because I'm the judge and I think that's... I mean, so despite the intentionally people are not going to follow this rule, like, concept, does anyone agree with me that I think the house, like, the difference between running the event at different places based on the judge, like, this is the most opportunity a judge has ever had to interpret the document. Because every other time we have a rule, it's pretty much black and white.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have we gone to Des Moines and there's been house rules?
Right, house rules on terrain and stuff. Like let alone pre-measuring. Like, hell, there was pre-measure Mark II events in Des Moines. Like,
well, I think what will happen is ultimately we'll start to treat this. I think the community will do the same thing to this they did the towing in. Towing in was never a thing.
It wasn't.
the
Neither
rules.
were hills. Like hills were only if you were a full inch above the table, which meant 2D hills are literally open terrain. Like that's how the
Yes.
game works. But everyone just agreed it didn't.
Had to be elevated.
Everyone just agreed
Yeah.
it worked.
Even on 3D
because
terrain,
We wanted to
everyone's
play
like,
the game and not.
everyone's like, my base is touching that hill, therefore I'm elevated. It's like that's not at all how hills work. And in the actual document,
The Hills Privateer Press used for their own events didn't follow their own rules
Right,
at
so-
any point.
What I think the community will do is just do that same process to pre-measuring. We'll all just kind of either spoken or unspoken agree to ignore it, unless Jason Souls and Will Pagani are like over your shoulder watching the game at the Warmachine Week qualifier finals.
Well, and it's not even the Warmachine Weekend qualifier finals. It's you don't have certainty until you go to the event. You don't even have certainty game to game what the rules are going to
No,
be. If you have a house
it'll
rule.
do. It'll play. If we do create that, if that happens and that divergence happens, which I 100% expect it to, it'll cause havoc in the tournament scene.
Let's take a step back and let's realize this is under CID for a reason. The CID process exists for a reason. And this is our opportunity. And the biggest thing I would suggest anybody, the point I would ask anybody listening to the podcast and the podcast members themselves is the number one thing is that obviously if this is not the direction that a lot of people feel like the game needs to go in, this is your opportunity to have your voice be heard. So please join the CID forums, play test the rules, and report what you find and report what the deficiencies are in it. Because I'm sure there's, because like you said earlier, Privateer Press wants to make a great game. They want us to have the best possible game experience they can give us. This is the opportunity. So to me, the swan song to this is our opportunity as a player base to have input in this. So before we go down this line of doomsaying, let's take a step and understand that this is, to a limited degree, controllable by its player base. And we need to be engaged in that.
And I'm going to read this sentence from the one marker rule is not something we will abandon. To me, I kind of have to question what you just said because they're telling me
Sure, question away, and that's perfectly fine. However, the one thing they did say, they have already made changes to it, and I think that there's room for that. I think there's room for that to be a good thing.
Well, the problem is with the table marker rule, and that's something they've said they're not going to compromise. I mean, we still have 3 weeks and change. Anything could change, but holy shit, is this rule terrible? And I mean, I try to remind myself of this when I get angry at the CID. Like I had this with Grimkin and the Pumpkin Heads. It's like, well, this is a nasty disaster. But thank God they didn't just publish their first draft because holy shit, that would be the worst.
That's true. I mean,
Oh, hey Karl, when you read that sentence, so the whole sentence is the one mark rule is not something we will abandon. Instead, the implementation of the rules up for feedback and discussion, along with the clarity of the rules is written. Right.
Sure,
so
but
is that what you're referring to, right?
yeah, that's the whole sentence. Sure. I think the argument we're making, Richie, is that the implementation probably doesn't matter. The clarity of the rule could be clearer, but if you're not going to abandon the one proxy-based rule, I don't know that implementation matters.
I think terminology matters a lot when we're talking.
One table marker.
One table marker. Yeah, there you go.
I completely agree with Scott's statement that this is our moment to basically raise our voices and give our feedback. This is part of me raising my voice to the community and saying that these are the reasons I emphatically disagree with this being a good decision to implement a rule such as this in its current state. So we should get out there and play test or practice or try as many different variations of rules we can and give our honest feedback to them. So I'm trying, and by basically releasing an episode like this, I want as many people to listen to it as possible and give their honest opinions and practice it as much as I can. So I'm basically saying we should definitely get on CID. And this is exactly the reason that I want CID to exist. Because without CID, if something slightly more polished than this, but effectively the same, was just released instead of put into CID, and they didn't realize that, like, even the putting measuring sticks end-to-end thing that immediately got switched as soon as someone probably like, oh no, you're right, that's totally needs to be in there, and we immediately implemented it into the document, is really important. And so if we've made this kind of leaps and bounds in one day, like what could we do in like 2 weeks to 2 months? Like, so it's really important.
I don't have any concern with like people using their soapbox, right? Like, because we're all on here for a reason, right? It's a soapbox for all of us at some level or another.
I think we're kind of like working our way here, but I'll go ahead and ask the question. Do we think that this may belong more in the sportsmanship guideline?
Yes.
Yes, I do agree it does, but sportsmanship is such a terrible thing in a competitive game. So like, I expect my opponents to be of the utmost sportsmanship, and I try to meet the same. But, like, yeah, like, within reason, like, this probably, in my opinion, comes up like one every maybe 200 games. Like, this rule would affect a game, but by the rule that this is, or the thing that this rule is meant to stop probably comes up 1 to less than 1% of games, and it, in effect, will affect every single game played in SteamRoller. Like, is that worth it? Like,
is it gonna stop? Fuck it. I'm gonna go get ice cream. No.
I understood that reference.
I know, right? Fuck it, I'm going for ice cream. And then comes back 45 minutes later with ice cream. All right, I'm done, and hits his clock. Like, God, you son of a bitch. So, I don't know, that's kind of where I'm at, and I think I've said that multiple times, but I just feel like the ends don't justify the means. Like, we're not fixing enough things to justify these loops, the hoops that we have to jump through.
There's nobody I know that does not want to see cleaner games. There's nobody I know that does not want to see the game progress into a much cleaner state, a much more user-friendly state. Is this the right way to do it? I mean, I think somewhere in the intention is a good thing, but the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. I think the thing that has to be examined is that there are things that, like, there are obviously repercussions to this. I actually am in favor of some kind of rev limiter to some of this, but I think, like a lot of people, I think somewhere there's a difference between what they're proposing with one marker and then the realities of how the game needs to play right now. And I think somewhere in between, there's that fine point that could probably be met.
I think you have to start looking at, because I think ultimately when you talk about cluttered tables, you talk about people losing track of markers, you're talking about the complication of the way the models interact with each other. So I think if the goal is to lower the confusion on the table, as kind of a blanket term for what they're talking about, I think you have to look at lowering the complications of the model's interactions. I think it's bigger than proxy bases.
I think it is too. Like, I'm sitting here thinking about it, and I'm just coming up with more and more issues every time I think about it more. Like, let's say I'm playing, like, I played one game of Oracles into another Legion player, because Karl wanted me to play it against him. So I'm playing one game of Oracles, and I'm like, all right, so I've got 3 Neriphs, a Seraph, 2 Angels, my caster, 2 Hellions, and I'm like, these models are fucking terrible for standing next to each other. And it's like, so now it becomes, well, I'm going to put this proxy here because my guy's like too close together, and my opponent's like, no, I think you can fit it there. Like, I don't think that's a justifiable table marker, and you're like, or proxy base, sorry, because it's a proxied model at that point. And so it's like, well, I think it is because I'm going to bump it like 4 times throughout the turn. And he's like, then we call the judge, and the judge is like, well, the model will actually fit there. And I'm like, so great, so now I have to, like, fidget with my dude's wings bumping each other every time I try and move because my opponent has a different level of intent on this rule than I do. Like, every time I think about this rule, I come up with new reasons I hate it. But, and again, this is the playtest or in theory rule, so I don't know. I think we are, like I said, I think I've played over 500 games. I can't think of a single time. Of course, I probably draw the line further than most people, which I totally accept. But, like, I guess it's, how about, Karl, how many games in Mark III have you played where you thought proxy bases or pre-measuring in general was used to an excessive amount, to where it was damaging to the game? Or damaging to, like, the integrity of the game?
I don't think that exists.
Okay. So you would say that your personal opinion of that number of games for you is 0.
Sure, but I have a different
exactly.
viewpoint
So
of the game
that's all
and-
of our opinions. Alex, I assume the same is true for you.
Yeah, 0
Okay.
games.
So
Up to and including the one game where I saw my opponent pre-measure his entire turn. I was no level of upset. He
Okay.
pre-measured all of that on his time, and like, yeah, that's your prerogative.
Mhm.
Done.
So it's happened to you to the most extreme it could possibly happen, basically, and you were like, "Yeah, that's great, because that's fine." Like, at no point did it perturb you in any way. You're like, "That's exactly how the rules should work, and if you want to do it that way, go for it."
It's your clock, use it.
Exactly. So, and I'm pretty sure, like most people of we're very like-minded people, so that's definitely gonna be how we think. So, Scott and Richie, has that happened in your games? I want to know. I actually want to. I'm not just. Like, I'm not trying to railroad you and say we all disagree with you. Like, I want to know, does that happen in your games? And you're like, this guy's using pre-measuring excessively and it annoys me in games, or I think it's outright cheating, or like, what level does this happen to you, or has it not happened yet?
It's really rare. I've had it happen like a couple times. For me, like my excessive amount was, let's see, like you always had the permanent bubble around Hellmouse, and you always had like permanent, like these are where the threat ranges can go, etc., etc.
Okay.
Like excessive amounts of markers and that type of stuff, and like that to me was a little much.
Just because you feel like your models are being invalidated because your opponent is never
not
allowing
really,
you to
like,
use them?
invalidated. It's like literally, like when I say like, I mean like the full like 12-inch bubble or 11.56-inch bubble or whatever
Is like measured
around
180 degrees.
Yeah, like it's measured 180 degrees to the point where I'm moving my own crap. Like I'm hitting like the dice or whatever, then we have to like put the crap back and just yeah.
Oh, you had those markers on the table during your turn?
Oh yeah. Or and
That's-
then
That's cheating.
and then
Yeah.
right, then I
That's
ask him to
cheating
move
under
him,
the-
right, then I
That's
ask
cheating
him to
under the
move him,
current
and then he-
rules.
Guys, let Richie talk, please.
Sorry.
There he goes. There's the clear throat talk conch
Yeah.
shell thing we're supposed to do. So, and then like even when you do that and you put them all back or whatever, and also when I see like really tricky like hellmouth pulls, like the spell from like Wormwood, and like you do this and move here and you move this and you move through this super intricate plan that has like 17 steps or whatever. Like, oh, it's off by a quarter of an inch at the very end, but I had this idea and it took me 20 minutes to do or whatever, and then you proceed with your turn. Like to me, it was a bit much. Yes, it's on their
Sure.
clock. Yes, we've been through that. Yes, we disagree on that point. I
Right. No,
understand.
I definitely agree. So basically what's going to happen, though, is the Hellmouth thing will effectively still happen. It will just take longer. But, I mean, your opponent shouldn't be allowed to have those markers down on your turn. Like, that's absolutely not okay. And if he refused to remove them, then we're talking about a whole different thing. But, so...
No, he moved and was like, "Hey, this needs to move out of my
Yeah,
way."
exactly. Like, yeah, hey, get your shit out of my way. And he's like, oh, yeah, I need to do that. And you're like, yeah, waste more of your time getting your shit out of my way. And so when it gets to the point of, like, measuring that and, like, he's still going to do that. I'm still going to pre-measure Hellmouths to make sure I don't lose the game on stupid broken models. And, like, that's going to happen. It's just going to take twice as long.
That reference was just for you, Brandon.
Yeah,
Just
I know,
want you
right?
to know, it's just for you.
So it's just going to take twice as long for me to measure every single model I move anywhere near them to be 11.6 inches away. Like, that's going to happen still. It's just going to take me longer. So the experience you have will simply be the same, except you'll sit there for even longer while your opponent makes sure that your rules don't work. And so it'll just be more boring for you.
I mean, he can't physically have that many table markers out.
No, he's just going to measure each model. He's not going to put the markers down, which is exactly why it takes longer. He's just, anytime he gets close to them, he'll just measure 11.5 and like, and I'm going to back up till it's 11.6 there. And then he's going to move the next model and do that, and the next model and do that, and the next model. So it's just making it less streamlined is all we're doing. It's not removing that at all. And when it comes to the, like outside of maximum threat ranges, it's exactly the same thing. Like, we're just making it take longer, which is the opposite of what we were told the intent was to stop. We wanted them to not pre-measure everything. So instead of letting them pre-measure all the threat ranges and stuff, we're going to let them pre-measure all the threat ranges and stuff, but make them do it slower. Like, that blows me away that that's even what we're talking about right now. And I understand that this is like an early draft rule, but like, this should not be a conversation. As soon as people are like, all of these reasons I don't think this is a good rule, they should be like, yeah, so let's talk about new things. Like, does anybody have some new insight or like? And then their immediate response was, we are basically married to the one table marker, and we're gonna die on this rock. Effectively, like, well, this is our chosen land. We're not giving this up. And like, I feel like there's some kind of agenda that they're refusing to tell us. Is basically how I feel, and I might be completely off base here, but that's how I feel. And I would like to know if that's actually true, and if like they're just trying to accomplish something they won't tell us. And
I mean, I could take a wild stab at the agenda.
Sure.
Because I would agree that they have one.
Yeah, there has to be, right? Like that's, and maybe they don't think it looks good on camera. Like, it could be as simple as that. And like, okay, well, give me an argument that we can talk about, because for all the points that we spent 2.5 hours talking about, I think you're completely off base, and your argument is irrelevant, is basically what I've come to, with a few small exceptions to basically, let's over-penalize every game so that the 1 in 1,000 games is slightly less annoying for that guy. I'm like, no. Like, that's the most ridiculous request I've ever heard. Like, it's like, everyone should be banned from the DMV so that I can go there faster. Like, no. That's not how it works. Like that's... We're fixing the smallest issues I can even imagine right now. Like honestly, the development team should come to me and tell me why Hellmouth's not broken, not the unit, the spell. Why Stranglehold's not broken, why Hellmouth the unit's not broken. Like, why aren't we talking about like this stuff basically, instead of like, my opponent's not allowed to have more than one table marker. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, who cares? Like, I would gladly hand my opponent 15 proxy bases if I thought it would at all help him during his turn. Like, so I don't, this, like, and it's because of my personal views, but I think this is the most ridiculous thing to even think about making a rule about. So I'm done yelling now. Other people talk.
I can see their intent. I see what they want to do. They want our intent with pre-measuring is so people didn't fail a charge, like, effectively when you read it, right? That's like how I read it. Like, you're not the 0.5 inch or whatever, you know. You're not some micrometer out of the charge range. Well, what they don't want is like all the intricate plans or whatever. But as Karl, as you brought up earlier, I'm not sure how you have a middle ground if you have pre-measuring. I am not sure how they change.
You can make.
We go to the point where you say you can only measure between two models. That is the only measurement you can do. Like, just say that. Or you can also measure control range. Like, you could maybe go that far. And then just say you can't have table markers. Like, but I don't want to play that game. And, like flat out, I don't want to play that game. I played so close. Like, that's more restricted than Mark II, basically. That because you were allowed to place table markers anywhere you wanted in Mark II at no restriction. So that means we're making it more restricted.
Jason would make the argument that you are not allowed to place table markers in Mark II.
He would, but the judge document overruled it, which is fine.
No, I don't remember the judge document if it had talked about table markers or not.
I don't think what they actually mean was we took it too far, and it's not what they intended. I don't think in any way that's what they actually thought. I think because they have their infernals tell us we can literally measure anything for any reason at any time, including bases and things, like, because they give us unlimited measuring. You cannot tell me at any point, unless there was a huge disconnect in communication, that happened. Like, I'm lead developer Jason Souls, and I tell Jim, the communications guy, to go tell the guy posting on our forum, you can do whatever you want whenever you want. And actually, what he said was measure distance between two models. That's the worst telephone game I've ever seen. Like,
that's probably to get to what it sounds like Jason Souls intended for Mark III. That's probably the best way to do it. Because you can measure control ranges, command ranges, and you can measure the distance between two models.
Yeah. You can measure auras and distance between two models, but not bases, not weird angles. Like, but now that we've played this, like, I don't think anyone has, again, like, gotten to the pre-measure step and said, man, this game is way worse now. Like, who does that? Like, because you don't win because your opponent made a dumb mistake because they don't understand geometry? Like, you want to win those games? I don't care.
Yeah,
from my perspective as a competitive player on the ground, with pre-measuring as it's been since the edition release, the game is better than it's ever been before. And to reverse that change is a straight step backwards.
Like insurmountable step backwards, I think.
Yeah, I do think that, and I don't think this is hyperbolic language. If we went back to a non-pre-measure game, I know I wouldn't travel to convention. I might just because to friends.
Yeah, we might do the local traveling. We do go to Des Moines and Omaha and Des Moines, but that's mostly just to see our buddies.
Just to drink with people, but I would not go with the intention of playing the game in any serious way. And I certainly wouldn't be buying any more models.
I just don't want to, it's not the game that I feel like devoting that quantity of my life to. I love this game because it's exactly what I want a game. It puts me versus another person in a competition in a way that is as friendly as possible and that I care the most about the setting. No game comes even remotely close. Let's say when I finally hit the point in Warmachine where I saw the rabbit hole and it no longer was just who charges farther. With the moment I saw that hole and went for it, I never looked back on Games Workshop games. Because that was what I was playing at the time, and maybe you were playing something else when you joined, or maybe you found something better. But I got to that point and I went down that hole and I was like, this literally is 10 times better than what I was used to. And pre-measure almost feels like that level, if not more. And going backwards, I just start looking for the next game that basically cloned Mark III before they ruined it, is basically my initial mindset, which I might change because I was not on board with pre-measuring originally, but after having it, it's just so much more tedious that it's not that's not fun anymore. I've reached a new level of fun. I've graduated beyond checkers and I want to play fucking go-karts. I want to go have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I endorse that 100%. Everything you just said, exactly where I'm at with this.
Because ultimately that's what we're here for. We're here to have fun. We can talk about what demonstrates the best player of Warmachine and what that means and what skills that should include, but we go to SteamRoller, so we pay thousands of dollars a year to travel these stupid things because we're having fun. And we as a community are telling the developers, I think, that part of that fun is pre-measuring that has made the game more fun.
And again, we're talking about the rule as it is currently, but from our perspective, the feedback we've gotten from the devs so far seems like they're pretty much married to the thing we have the biggest problem with. So unless that changes, I can only imagine we're going to be talking about something like this next week. And hopefully we reach some kind of middle ground that everyone's happy with, like I said at the beginning.
Yeah, hopefully we do.
Yeah. Exactly what I said. I don't know if Scott was walking away at that moment or not, but Scott, did you hear what I said about making a semi-quasi-judge document that heavily obligates you into doing certain things? Did you hear that?
No, but I think I got the context from it when you were speaking about it later. Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that I don't know, even as the rule as it's written, I would not want to see it implemented as it is.
Right, and I don't think even Ritchie, who so far has been the most for it, has even said that he has problems with the wording. He likes probably the intent behind it, but he thinks that it needs a lot of overhauling before it becomes something that we should look to implement, which of course it's in rough draft mode, so it's supposed to be that way. But
sure, yeah. I mean, Legalese is going to get a hold and they'll do their thing to it. But,
we all love legalese.
Yeah, but I think anything that makes the game more fun for people is obviously what needs to be promoted, and that's what I'm hoping shows through. So I mean, when we talk about this, I actually agree with a lot of the positions everybody's stating. It's just there is another side of the coin, and I think that other side of the coin should and was represented, and that was really the point.
So moving on to our final topic, which actually technically takes us out of the pre-measuring argument. It's now 7 turns. Okay. So the intent behind 7 turns, I feel like this was an intent to eliminate.
Well, hold on, we didn't talk about the 5-hour talk. We've only like started this podcast.
All right, I'm going to keep talking over Karl, and Karl's going to get muted. Yeah, Karl got muted.
No, I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on this whole. This is how
he's literally muted. Okay, moving on. We should probably unmute him. I think the intent behind this, which at least I hope, is they're trying to eliminate the super late game. Like, we both have like 2 minutes on our death clock, and we're going to try and play 5 more turns real quick. Like, I think that's what this was intended to stop, in which case, good job. I think this is an exact example of a rule that is really good at doing that. I haven't come up in the few games I've played so far where 7 turns has been overly restrictive. I haven't made up my final mind on that. I'm still going to play some more games, obviously, but I think this would, if that was what this was meant to stop, they did a good job of coming up with an abstract way to deal with a serious problem.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. The first of which is the way the scenarios are designed. Like, I was a massive critic of the scoring system, the random game length, and all that stuff. Like, I just don't like it. Or I didn't like it on the face of it. Looking at the scenarios as they are now, if the scoring cap was any lower, the scenarios would be too easy to win within 2 turns.
Absolutely.
Which is a problem. With the distance as it is now, it is also too hard to end the game quickly.
I ran into that exact problem when I was playing a game on Wednesday. The game was over, but I couldn't end the game.
So if you remove execution errors, basically if you allow unlimited pre-measuring, games tend to be more mature. They tend to go to their natural conclusion, where top-level strategic decisions win out and somebody was proved correct or incorrect or random factors happen. If you're going to a mature game and you have unlimited pre-measuring, I think the majority of games end at turn 7. Like, end at the timer that they set. Not because, that's where the game ends, but that's because, where the turn length says it ends at. And I think there's a viable game to be played principally inside of tie breaks. I think it's different from the face of what Warmachine has been so far. But yeah, that's what you get. And I think the only way you cannot be hitting that turn 7 limit is if you increase the amount of execution errors in the game. Or if you just have games be swingier, or if strategic decisions go different from player expectations.
Because when I first read it, because I was actually super happy that they changed the random game length. I'll go ahead and just get that right off the chat.
That was a bad idea.
That literally, I want to sell every Legion model I have. Please get them out of here. I'll never play this game again. So, but they did change that. So kudos, PP. Love you. Great. But then I saw the definite end on set, and so I was like, my first thought was, how do I build a list of scores like a couple, and then just sits there and never dies and wins on tie breaks?
That's a lot of people are kind of exploring that right now.
Yeah, Virus too.
Yeah, well, I built a Karchev list with 2 units of Kazi eliminators and Jaws of the Wolf, and 7 Khador heavies.
I mean, that'll probably be a viable way to play the game.
Is that a good way to play the game? That's not Body and Soul was viable. It wasn't good for it.
No, yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, I think there's a viable face to competitive Warmachine with that in place. It changes the game a lot from the race to 5 that we have, or it changes the face of the game a lot. Is it a game that we all want to play? I think that what it takes to answer that question will take way longer than 4 weeks to pan out. That'll be something that we answer for SR 2018. There's no possible way it can be done in SR 2017.
Well, there's no question that 2016 has a lot of errors, or not errors, but issues that could be better, opportunities to progress. And
I'm gonna say it straight up. Close dominate was the biggest problem with SteamRoller over the last 2 years. Secure dominating from the backline.
Sure, I don't disagree with that necessarily either. I don't like me playing a game that doesn't feel like it came to fruition because my opponent randomly went on scenario way too easy when I'm actually playing the game. And I can't win on scenario by being aggressive because I really should just turtle on my flag because it's the correct way to play the game. Like, that's certainly an issue, and that's among other issues that might even be in the packet. But so a lot of people are giving a lot of pushback saying that this is too much of a shakeup all at once. We should basically laser focus on issues and fix them. But instead, we got basically this complete rewrite with a whole new direction on it. And a lot of people are having pushback on that. But honestly, I have to say, for how different it is than what we had before and how completely, like, out of nowhere this came from, I'm actually pretty excited to go playtest some scenario. Like, 2016, I'm like, that's same old shit. They can't have fucked up that bad. I didn't really playtest anything. Yeah. And in CID, I'm like, other than the pre-measure thing, which we just spent 4.5 hours talking about, I'm really excited to go playtest this because I think small adjustments might be extremely important in making this what could be maybe better than 2016 and maybe even just awesome. As where if we don't put that time in, like say 2,000 people enter in CID, and sorry, I'm just going to finish this point and I'll be done. But
I agree, yeah. I mean, I think it could be great. I think for me, the thing that's been literally occupying my soul and attention since CID went live is how much of a disaster the pre-measure ruling is. I'm really interested in testing it, but there is just such a massive, massive catastrophe in front of me that, like, I don't have the mental bandwidth to deal with anything else.
That's part of the problem. It's taken away from the rest of the packet so much.
And that's exactly what I tell everybody. It's like, and they're like, how's the new SteamRoller pack? And I'm like, well, the scenarios and everything. And he's like, everything but, like, the rule changes seems really exciting and awesome. And then I'm like, but on the other hand, there's this dick chopping machine over here I gotta shove my legs into and then just let it eat me so that I don't hate myself. Like, I don't even know what's happening. Like,
can we talk a little bit about the proposed dropping of Divide and Conquer?
Yeah, fuck that rule. Get it the fuck out of here.
Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty much a quick discussion.
Present me a logical, well-put argument as to why DNC is beneficial.
DNC doesn't solve the problem it was intended to solve and makes it worse.
I 100% agree.
I'm real excited about that potentially going away. That could be a big step forward, I think.
When did Mark III come out? From post-lock and load through Warmachine weekend, I was sitting on a 90% win rate, over 90% win rate with Kador. Over half of those losses came from being stuck by DNC.
If you look at the last 2 to 3 years at the finals games, there is a significant percentage of list lock games in the finals.
It's like that should have been really good matches, but like one or both sides are list locked, and we watch just straight shit shows on like videoed games that are being streamed. And so even if we only break it down to PP wanting to stream good games, like they should be all for banning DMC because it 100% increases the quality of the final round.
Well, they basically did in Iron Gauntlet.
Well, sure. So the thing is also, DNC isn't even a standard variant. It's only supposed to be in Masters normally.
It is a standard variant in the new SteamRoller. And the new SteamRoller packet, it is, as written, it is a standard variant.
2017 is supposed to be standard DNC. But as 2016 has been, it has not been standard. But almost every large tournament uses it because there's this archaic logic that we're playing more than 2 rounds. We got to use DNC or it's not fair. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, this is the worst. Like, it has no bearing on player skill, matchups, or anything. It's 100% luck of the draw. And anyone that tries to argue against that is wrong. Objectively. Like, we can show you on paper.
I mean, they're already limiting you to the one faction.
Yeah, I know, right?
It's mathematically provable that it randomly allocates rewards and punishments on the basis of nothing.
Yep.
Oh, it also intensifies players attempting to deal with extremely powerful common casters get screwed by it more than the people playing those casters because they get locked out of their answer.
That's what my point on I did my first point on the CID forum was making that exact point. I kind of wanted to bring up one kind of interesting thing you talked about. They wanted to limit the end of death clock chaos that happens. So to actually not clock yourself before your 7 turns is up, you have to average 8.5 minutes per turn, which is almost hardcore times. Like, that's 8.5 minutes per turn is moving.
But that's an average, and we understand there will be spikes and drops, but like, you're also deploying on your clock, and your first turn generally takes less time than your deployment.
So I would say that, right, so that really your deployment and your first turn probably kind of average one normal turn, so I still think you have to average about 8.5 minutes per turn.
Well, rounds 2 through 4 are typically the longest in the game, then everything after that gets progressively shorter.
Sure. Yeah, maybe you won't clock yourself, but I think a lot of times you'll clock yourself before the game ends on 7.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, some people are just gonna build, because I'm gonna try it, because that's what CID's for, right? Is you're supposed to try to push boundaries and say, no, this doesn't work because of X in this Y situation. I'm just gonna score a couple points. I'm gonna sit here and never die. I mean, it's where you're supposed to try to break stuff. I like super long, grindy games, and so having just an arbitrary limit, or I know when this ends, it does give the second player a huge advantage there, because they're well, now I can move here, and here, and I would get slaughtered, but I'm not going to, because it's over.
You say that. There was actually a post on the CID talking about statistics of the battle reports posted so far, and there's still a pretty significant advantage for going first.
I'm going to ask for, sample size.
No, sure, it's the games posted so far, so it's not thousands, but it's pretty significant all the same.
I think the turn limit is actually a limiter on these scenarios are almost impossible to win straight up, especially Recon. Fuck Recon. Recon's a disaster, but these scenarios are almost impossible to win straight up. The game needs to end at some point before you get army wipe.
I think there's a pretty large disparity in the winnability of scenarios, and that might be an issue, because the Pit 2 is very winnable, I think, especially by armies.
Recon is almost impossible to win, and then the Pit 2 is significantly more winnable.
Yeah, because if you're playing against a gun line and you're against a Kador list, and they don't get in the zone because they can't, and then all of a sudden you're down 4 control points, you're
Yeah, I was going to offer that of a couple of games that some local friends have been playing, much to my surprise, a lot more of them have with a 6-point lead scenario victory than I thought would.
I don't ever expect to see Recon 1 on scenario.
Yeah, and they're probably trying to intentionally stress test it, which is why it's in CID right now, because they want to know what the impossible would be and what the extremely achievable is, to try and find that happy middle for everything. And also in the past, we've just seen scenarios that I don't even care if you tell me try and tell me that they're balanced. Some scenarios are intended to be much harder to win, like Line Breaker and Recon. These are generally harder to win scenarios than Incursion and Take and Hold and the Pit. They're clearly not in the same category as far as easeability to win.
All right, so the packet on the Sheely scale of fail.
The packet included as a whole as printed.
Yes.
Probably 9 out of 10 barrels of nuclear waste. The immediate amendment to it probably dropped it down to a 6, because that was a pretty big gimme on the immediate next day.
My rating is a violet blue Crayola crown.
All right, that's strong.
Yeah, I don't know if it's violet or it's blue. Yeah, it's neither.
Alex, I'll give you an example. I give it 7 pizza rolls.
I give it 5 upended armadillos crushed by a truck.
Nice! I like this guy. He can make it here.
That's pretty, I don't know about that. I don't think I can top that.
Scott.
I give it 9 out of 20 Mad Dogs.
9 out of 20? Yeah, you mean... All right. Richie, go ahead.
I'm going to give it 10 Marauders out of a list pair. There you go.
Okay, so half the Marauders. All right. Karl.
Do I get to go now?
You get to go now. Richie's done, because you didn't cut him like a dick.
I'm going to give it 12 out of 20 free Legion points.
Nice. See, this was easy. This has been Brandon, or guy who complains on a soapbox of anger and hatred and sadness. Or PG Mulus on the forums.
It's Jeremy.
Karl.
Scott.
This has been Richie.
This has been Alex, and I'm sad.
Sad koala.